Hey everyone, hope you're all doing great. Welcome back to the Anime Fictions 2.0. Today, we're diving into part 2 of What If Naruto selected for Team 8. If you're enjoying these alternate timelines, make sure to hit that subscribe button, share it with your friends, and check out the other videos on the channel. And of course, drop your thoughts in the comments. I always love hearing your ideas. Alright, enough talk, let's get into the story. Chapter 6. Naruto kept an eye on Hinata as they ascended the Hokage's tower. She seemed a lot steadier than before, which was good, but he didn't want to take any chances either. He also studiously avoided making any sort of eye contact with Shino. He was pretty sure the damn bug user had been silently laughing at him since he'd arrived at the base of the tower that morning. He looked down at Naruto and the sleeping Hinata without saying a single word. Finally, Naruto had whispered she's really tired, as quietly as he could. I can see, Shino replied deadpan. Unfortunately, with that high collar, Naruto couldn't see the boy's mouth to be sure. Nonetheless, he silently promised himself to kick the larger boys but the next time they sparred. And to top off the day's weirdness, his shoulder still felt warm where her head had rested on it. At least the Chunin guarding the Hokage's office had retained their attitude adjustment from the previous day, though Naruto wondered if that would necessarily have been true if Kurenai-sensei hadn't been bringing up the rear. At least he knew the Hokage's smile wasn't feigned when they entered his office. He murmured as they stood at attention before his desk. He held out a pair of scrolls for Kurenai. The scroll with the blue seal contains the details of your assignment. You will be patrolling that section of the border with Earth Country for 3 weeks, starting 3 days from now. That should allow you plenty of time to travel and familiarize yourself with the area. The scroll with the red seal is to be presented to the leader of the team currently in place, a named Deriketsu. We're relieving Deriketsu's team? Kurenai asked, her voice holding a little edge. Yes, the Hokage answered, gesturing at with his pipe. Do you know him? Kurenai nodded. In passing. I am surprised he was put in charge of such a sensitive location. The old man grunted, and a rueful expression passed over his face, disappearing so quickly Naruto wondered if he'd imagined it. There have been a few incidents lately. Skirmishes that seem to straddle the line between our two countries. It's never really clear which side of the border it started on, so there have been messy diplomatic repercussions. There are a lot of people over there that are still angry about a war fought before your genins were born. To give our envoy to Earth something to use, he can now inform them that Deriketsu's team of combat veterans has been replaced with a genin team, and request that they reciprocate. I'm explaining this because I want all of you to adopt a very flexible approach to border intrusions. You want us to just let anyone through? Naruto asked in disbelief. No, the Hokage said firmly as he shook his head. But I do want you to make sure that if you intercept someone, it happens in a location that makes it very clear who violated whose border. Naruto frowned as he puzzled over his leader's words. So you want us to make sure the other side gets the blame if there's a fight? The Hokage nodded. Yes, although I hope there won't be any confrontations, especially if Earth stands down their patrol as well. Kurenai spoke up again. We will make sure we always patrol a few kilometers back from the actual border, so any confrontations will occur on fire territory. The Hokage nodded. Very well. Good luck, and I will see you in about 3.5 weeks. Your relief will have a scroll with a red seal like that one. Do not accept messages from anyone who does not have such a scroll. Understood? They all nodded, and with that they left the Hokage's office. Starting his first C-ranked mission, Naruto wanted to jump into the air and shout Yada, but two things stopped him. The first was Kurenai's lectures to her team about proper decorum. Hinata already seemed familiar with all the rules, and while Shino appeared mildly interested, Naruto figured they were aimed primarily at him. The other was Hinata's condition, the reasons for which he did not fully understand. Team 8 moved through the streets of Konoha at a quick walk, heading for the nearest gate. Stepping through the portal wasn't anything they hadn't already done dozens of times, but somehow it felt different. He nervously adjusted the kunai holster on his right leg, and resisted the urge to pull one out and twirl it by the ring at the end of the handle. They were on the trade road that led to Earth Country for over 2 hours before Kurenai called for a break. Naruto was still full of energy, but he noticed Hinata was faltering. Her apparent lack of rest the previous night was catching up with her. She slipped her bag off her shoulders, sat down at the base of a tree, and leaned back, closing her eyes. Naruto frowned and sat down next to his teammate. You may want to take your arm and leg weights off, if you're still wearing them, he said quietly. Hinata started at the sound of his voice, eyes popping open again. After a moment she self-consciously grasped her forearm through the sleeve of her jacket. Ayano, that is all right, Naruto. Naruto frowned. But if you are tired it might help, he said reasonably. Hinata smiled. But then I will just have more weight to carry in my bag. Naruto shrugged. We can stick them in my pack. I didn't stay up all night, and I missed having you the crap out of me last night. Hinata smiled wearily, and Naruto thought he heard a small snort of laughter. Her hand tightened around her sleeve again. Seriously, Naruto, I will be all right. I won't improve if I don't keep the weights on, will I? Well, Naruto said slowly, it depends. Guy-sensei said that if you overuse the muscles in your arms and legs, you sometimes have to leave the weights off until you recover. Of course, the stabbing pains and muscle tears the man described to Naruto never seemed to last longer than a few minutes. But then again, he probably hadn't ever really hurt himself that way. Hinata looked thoughtful. I am a bit sore, but not in that way. I should probably keep them on, she said firmly. Then she looked down at the ground between her legs. I appreciate your concern, she added politely. Naruto found himself scratching at the back of his head again. Yeah? Well, you're my teammate after all, he said. For some reason her shoulders slumped after he said that. And you're really fun to spar with, he added. Hinata nodded without looking up and Naruto decided to go see Kurenai-sensei before he said something stupid again. Kurenai did not want to make Hinata any more self-conscious than necessary, so she was subtle in her attempts to keep an eye on the girl. She took note of the Hyuga's condition using her peripheral vision, and always when something else seemed to draw her attention. Naruto and Shino's concern for their teammate was more obvious, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Kurenai hoped that the boy's concern would make an impression on the girl. Naruto was as obvious as he was sincere, a felicitous combination in this situation. After a couple of hours on the trade road, Kurenai called for a quick break. Hinata's fatigue was becoming more and more apparent with every step, and it didn't surprise her that Hinata, after a brief conversation with Naruto, had fallen asleep leaning against a tree. Naruto walked toward Kurenai as she fished her canteen out of her pack and took a small swallow. He had an uncharacteristically grim look on his face, displacing his normal smile. She's exhausted, he said quietly. I don't think her father should have insisted on her training all night. Kurenai bit back the first couple of things she wanted to say, and settled for just nodding her agreement. The blonde genin opened his mouth like he had more to say, but after a moment he just closed it, shaking his head as he walked off toward Shino. He deliberately scuffed his feet on the ground, kicking any loose pebbles or twigs in his path, and Kurenai didn't need any special to read his frustration. 10 minutes later, after they'd all had a drink and refreshed themselves, they were ready to resume their journey, but the girl was still sound asleep. Kurenai was contemplating how best to wake her charge when Naruto and Shino walked up to their teammate in a fairly matter-of-fact manner. Naruto picked up Hinata's bag and handed it to Shino, who in turn locked the straps with his own pack. Naruto turned back to his teammate and visibly swallowed. Then he quickly bent over and wrapped one arm around Hinata's legs, loosely grasping her shoulder with his other hand. He carefully straightened up and Hinata was neatly folded over his shoulder, still sleeping. Kurenai recognized the academy-taught method for carrying a wounded comrade who was stable enough to travel, but unable to walk on their own. What amazed her was the fact that the girls slept through the entire process. That could only indicate acute fatigue, combined with almost total chakra depletion. It was surprising she made it as far as she did, Kurenai decided. Naruto turned toward his sensei and slowly nodded. I'm ready, he said quietly. Kurenai frowned. Naruto was holding himself a little stiffly, and she remembered that he was wearing weights on his arms and legs as well. Are you sure about this, Naruto? The boy nodded carefully. It'll be good training, I think. Kurenai wondered if he'd been spending too much time with Guy and Lee. Hinata awoke feeling painfully stiff. She blinked up at the ceiling wondering how she'd arrived. The last thing she remembered was taking a short break on the side of the road, but now she appeared to be in a room of some sort. Attempting to sit up was a mistake, she immediately realized, as her abused muscles punished her mercilessly. Her body felt stiff as a board, but far more tender. She stifled a low moan. "Ah, you are awake," a voice said in the darkened room. Hinata's fingers slowly formed the seals under the coverlet as she whispered Byakugan. She released her blood limit as soon as she sensed Kurenai-sensei was the only other person in the room. "None of that," Kurenai said sharply, making Hinata twitch painfully. "Your reserves are still very low," she continued in a kindlier tone. "Kindly restrict your chakra usage until you have fully recovered." "Jigomen," Hinata stammered, her face flushing. "Now, regarding this special family training of yours," Kurenai began, letting her voice trail off. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" she finally asked. "No, sensei," Hinata replied quietly. "Hinata, I put you to bed," her teacher said in a chiding tone. "I saw. You were covered with bruises and abrasions. Your chakra was so low, I was amazed you could even move, let alone walk for 2 hours. What kind of training leaves you incapacitated?" Hinata opened her mouth to answer, but then closed it. "I am not permitted to discuss certain things with people outside my family," she finally said. Kurenai sighed. "Be that as it may, you are still a ninja on active duty with the leaf. As such, you are required to keep yourself in good health, and that does not include letting yourself become disabled when you know you have a mission the next day." "Gomen, sensei," I said, Hinata began, but then swallowed her next words. It was shameful to spout excuses for her failures and shortcomings. "You told your father, didn't you?" Kurenai asked in a shrewd tone. "Remember, Hinata, I was there when you left for the academy. Your father makes no secret of his contempt for the other shinobi of the village." Hinata's only response was a choked sound. "Do not apologize for matters over which you have no control, Hinata," Kurenai continued in a kindlier voice. Then her voice changed, becoming more formal in tone. "But I will require you to refuse any training or exercises that could compromise your ability to participate in our missions. As your join, I have the authority to do that. Your responsibility is to convey that directive to your father if the situation ever arises again." Hinata inhaled sharply at the thought of how such a conversation would go. As if reading her thoughts, Kurenai sighed. "I know that will not be easy for you, but if something like this happens again, either you or your father will have to answer for it. If, after explaining my orders, you are still forced, then it will not be your fault. Do you understand?" Hinata nodded slowly, ignoring the ache. But the thought of refusing her father filled her with dread. "Good. And Hinata, if you ever need to, well, my door is open if you need to talk after we return to Konoha. This inn will be serving dinner soon if you are hungry. Your uniform is next to you on the floor. I'm going to go look at Naruto and Shino." The door slid aside, and then back, and Hinata knew she was alone. Shino was limping slightly as he followed his teammate back to the inn. They were only a day's travel from the border with Earth, so they decided to spend the extra day at a roadside inn that typically served merchants traveling between Fire Country and Earth Country. Of course, sitting still for a day did not appeal to Naruto. Immediately after breakfast he began urging them to train. Kurenai wanted to keep an eye on the still sleeping Hinata, so Shino followed Naruto out into the woods to spar. Naruto had evidently needed to work out some of his agitation and frustration regarding their teammate, because Shino couldn't recall ever getting the excrement kicked out of him this badly since he'd started at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Fortunately, the blonde genin remembered to pull his punches, so Shino only had some mild contusions to add to his puzzled embarrassment. The boy's speed had increased to a remarkable degree, and the power behind his blocks and counters threatened to knock the larger boy out of his stances every time they clashed. This isn't to say that the bug user hadn't gotten in a few shots of his own, one of which he'd inadvertently landed at full force when Naruto tried to duck under it and go for a sweep. The result was a small mouse under the blonde's left eye, and a throbbing wrist that bothered Shino more and more as the adrenaline wore off. The blow barely fazed his opponent, who merely came to his feet after a backwards roll and nodded acknowledgement of the point. The changes wrought in Naruto's fighting style by his supplemental training were all too apparent to Shino. Gone were the awkward, exaggerated versions of the basic taijutsu stances. Naruto's footing was now sure and his movements exceptionally fluid. His attacks and counters were less straightforward and more circular in motion. Naruto still favored attacking from unusual directions, but his dependence on the terrain had lessened. He didn't hesitate to launch himself into the air for a flying kick, confident that his speed would allow him to complete the move without being caught in the air. Indeed, the one time Shino managed to catch one of Naruto's high kicks, the genin simply twisted in midair and used a scissoring motion to bring his other heel crashing into the side of the Kakanin's head. The worst part was that Naruto had done all this with nearly half of Shino's colony attached to his back, steadily draining chakra until they let go, replete. That was something he'd rarely seen an individual Kakai bug do, let alone dozens of them at once. The amount of chakra they drained from the boy was amazing. The worst part of all was that Naruto didn't even seem to have noticed. Shino frowned at Naruto's back as he followed the boy back to the inn. Chakra reserves that large were rare in A, let alone a genin. Could it be linked to the mystery surrounding Naruto that his father was forbidden to discuss? His mind worked furiously as Naruto, still energized from the sparring, babbled happily about a dozen topics at once. The only thing that came to mind was his father's words about relying on first-hand observations. Listening to his teammate wonder if Hinata was awake yet, and if he could talk the cook into serving ramen, Shino decided to do just that. For now. Naruto bounced in his seat as he waited for their food to arrive. Sparring with Shino had really woken up his appetite, especially since he'd actually held his own against his taller teammate. He was also happy to discover that the inn's proprietors, a middle-aged couple who apparently rarely visited Konoha, didn't seem to be aware of his prisoner and treated him so nicely it was a little disconcerting. The wife, who ran the kitchen, kept patting him on the head and saying how he reminded her of her son. She was quite a good cook, and boasted experience in many regional cuisines, so she seemed a little disconcerted when her favorite guest asked for ramen. Normally, she said such a dish was a bit beneath her talents, but she couldn't seem to say no when Naruto smiled and bowed apologetically with his palms together. Naruto was working on his second bowl, trying to puzzle out the unusual spices the nice old lady had mixed into the broth, when a voice coming from behind him almost made him fall to the floor. "Ramen again?" Kurenai asked in a disapproving tone. Yeah," Naruto said, ducking his head as he turned toward his sensei. "I'm going without for 3 weeks as it is," he continued in a slightly petulant tone. Kurenai sighed. 3 weeks of trail rations and whatever we can gather on our own. All the more reason to eat nutritious food when you have the opportunity, Naruto. Not just bowl after bowl of noodles. "I do not think there is any danger of Naruto becoming malnourished at this inn," Shino observed. "Not after the breakfast he was served." Naruto turned back and glared across the table at his teammate. "You're just mad because Obasan almost swatted one of your bugs when she saw it on your shoulder. The reckless slaughter of innocent and productive creatures is not something to take lightly," Shino insisted in a frosty tone. "She might have been more careful in her judgment if she had not been distracted attempting to sate your appetite." Naruto stuck his lower lip out and scowled at his teammate. "I didn't ask her to do that. It's just, every time she came out of the kitchen and she saw my plate was empty, she put more food on it." He shrugged. "Maybe she had a lot of food that was about to go bad or something." Shino didn't respond to that, but Naruto did hear the muted buzzing that sometimes occurred when his teammate was displeased about something. Naruto figured it was his bugs reacting, but he really didn't want to think too much about that. Kurenai sat down next to Shino, and soon the cook was taking her dinner order as well. With a warm smile at Naruto, the older woman bustled back to her kitchen to prepare the Jonin's food. It had been a long time since Naruto had actively wondered what it would be like to have a mother. Normally, he was too busy for such thoughts, which was at least partially intentional. But now, waiting for Hinata to recover so they could resume their journey, Naruto had an unusually large amount of time on his hands. He found himself thinking more and more about the innkeeper's reactions. What would it be like to live in a village where everyone treated him like that? Konoha was his home, but what would it be like to not have people glaring at him all the time, praying for his death, or telling their children to stay away from that Uzumaki brat? Those thoughts made him very uncomfortable, and he tried to suppress them without much success. Then he followed Kurenai's advice from several weeks ago, and tried to logically examine his options. If he tried to move to another village, his new neighbors would want to know why. If they ever found out he had a demon bound within his stomach, Naruto knew his welcome would expire soon afterwards. Even if he came up with a believable story, he'd still need to be able to make a living. He knew a little about being a ninja, but not much else. He couldn't join another hidden village as a shinobi for several reasons. 1. He'd be hunted down as a missing nin by the Konoha A and BU squads. 2. his new employers would probably be able to detect that stupid damn fox, and he'd be back at square one with everyone fearing and hating him. 3. Eventually he'd be sent on a mission where he'd have to fight one of his former classmates. While he wouldn't mind kicking Sasuke's butt, having to fight Shino, Lee, or Hinata for real was not something he could even consider without going into a cold sweat. No, he was stuck with Konoha in much the same way Konoha was stuck with him. A small, perverse corner of his mind was pleased by that. It would make becoming Hokage even sweeter. With a smile, he readdressed himself to the oddly seasoned ramen. But after a couple of bites, he noticed that everyone else was staring at something immediately to his left. He quickly swallowed and turned his head as well. Hinata, a little pale and unsteady, was easing herself onto the bench next to him. Naruto almost reached out to steady her, but something made him hesitate. Remembering her insistence that she could carry her own bag and wear her weights despite her exhaustion, he realized that trying to help her might make her feel even more self-conscious. So he refrained, and wondered if he was actually getting smarter about such things. Or was his sudden intuition merely dumb luck? Gomen, Hinata said quietly. You were right, Naruto, she continued in a subdued voice, about the weights, and everything. Naruto just shrugged at his teammate, wondering if something else was wrong. I'm just glad you're feeling better, he said. I missed you. Naruto coughed suddenly as Hinata's eyes widened. I mean, I miss sparring with you. Last night. You know. Like we always do, he added quickly. Hinata just nodded her agreement, looking downward the entire time. The next day, they were back on the road again, bright and early. Naruto was still a little groggy and yawned frequently for the first hour. The pallets they'd slept on were far softer than he was used to, so he had trouble sleeping at night. Surprisingly, the innkeeper's wife got up early as well, to send them on their way with a good breakfast. Catching Kurenai's look, Naruto made sure to thank her and let her know how much he appreciated her efforts. The way the older lady just beamed at him made him feel very strange, and he found himself blushing as they left. After they left the inn, Kurenai-sensei walked beside him for a while, and thanked him for not taking advantage of the cook's friendliness. Naruto frowned at his sensei. Why would I do that? He asked. Kurenai smiled thinly. Why indeed? She doesn't act like most of the other villagers you've known. I talked to her briefly the day before. Her son, a boy you bear a passing resemblance to, went to Konoha several years ago to attend the ninja academy. Really? Naruto asked. What rank is he now? Have we met him? He died during his Chunin exam, Kurenai answered in a somber tone. Naruto tripped over his own feet. Oh, he said as he stumbled for a moment. I will admit, Kurenai continued, that I was slightly concerned that you might inadvertently take advantage of the situation. But aside from asking her to make ramen for you, she continued, making him duck his head a little, your behavior was entirely appropriate. I didn't think it was that big a deal, Naruto grumbled. She did ask me what my favorite food was. Kurenai nodded at that. As I said, I am glad you did not take advantage of the situation. Naruto scratched the back of his head. Ano-sensei, if I do that when people are nice to me, won't that encourage them to treat me like everyone else does? Kurenai nodded. Very good, Naruto. You are thinking ahead and considering the consequences of your actions. Naruto found his face reddening again. Kurenai nodded at him, and then turned to speak with Shino. Naruto took that as his cue to speed up a little, so he was walking beside Hinata. A good dinner, during which the nice old lady tried to stuff the weary kunoichi with as much food as she could hold, and another full night's sleep had restored most of Hinata's energy. She was still moving a little slower than normal, but she was out on point this morning, periodically activating her blood limit to do quick scans of the area around them. They walked together in a silence that was actually fairly comfortable. Naruto wondered if concentrating on the woods around them, scanning for an ambush, kept his teammate too busy to get nervous. They hadn't discussed exactly how Hinata had been transported to the inn, and he wasn't about to bring up that subject anytime soon. Naruto wasn't completely sure why he'd been the one to carry the girl. Of course, if there was danger, it would be better if their job was unburdened. But he couldn't say for sure if that had even occurred to him at the time. What he did know was that her arm and leg weights were contributing to her fatigue, and she wouldn't even have been wearing them if he hadn't shown his off. He realized that seeing her exhausted and full of pain made him feel worse than he would if it had been himself. He wondered if this was what it was like to have friends, this feeling that you'd rather hurt yourself than see them in pain. In a sudden flash of insight, Naruto understood why they'd been taught that shinobi should avoid friendships and close personal relationships with their comrades. The thought of his friend being hurt, or even killed, made him feel physically ill, like he'd drunk all the bad milk in Konoha in one sitting. But why had Kurenai-sensei urged him to become friends with his teammates? Then Naruto remembered his role in the team. He was supposed to cover their escape if they were ambushed or overrun. In that situation, he supposed it was useful if he cared a lot about his teammates. Naruto glanced back at his sensei. Had she pushed him to make friends so he would be more likely to sacrifice himself for them? That was a very uncomfortable thought, and it made Naruto feel very cold inside. He'd come to value Kurenai-sensei's wisdom and all the things she taught him. The idea that she was doing so just to manipulate him, but she hadn't really, had she? He needed to think this through, the way she taught him. Naruto recalled their first conversation at Moritake's. She'd already explained his role on Team 8, and asked him how hard he was willing to work to achieve his long-term goals. She hadn't really concealed anything from him, and her expectations were straightforward. If she really was just trying to get rid of the Kyuubi like the other villagers wanted, she wouldn't have set up extra training for him, now would she? Naruto admitted to himself that when he first became a genin, his taijutsu had been awful. Training with Gai-sensei and Lee, he was much more likely to survive any situation they got into. Naruto also remembered a conversation he'd had with the Hokage, many years ago, when the old man explained how the Hokage was the shinobi who protected everyone in the village, with his wisdom as well as his strength. That was the day that Naruto decided that he would become the Hokage someday. No one could ignore his existence then. Were his current duties all that much different? True, Kurenai-sensei was doing most of the thinking here, but wasn't it Naruto's job to help protect his teammates? Wasn't that just like what the Hokage did? Or at least a little bit like it? Maybe he was trying to see underneath the underneath when there was no real underneath to see. Naruto tried to think his way through this question as the sun climbed steadily in the sky. Around noontime, Kurenai called a halt so they could eat some trail mix and drink from their canteens. Seeing as how there was no stream nearby, she also showed them a new for permanently summoning small amounts of water by collecting the humidity present in the ground and air around them. Naruto was eager to learn any new he could, and watched Kurenai slowly form the seals with eager eyes. Hinata and Shino both performed the simple without much trouble, while Naruto frantically practiced the seals. When it was his turn, Naruto was a little nervous, but managed to form the seals correctly as he said Suetun, condensation. However, instead of a 2-inch wide spinning vortex of air appearing over the mouth of his canteen, Naruto summoned one nearly a foot across. The torrent of water that gushed down out of it not only filled his canteen, but it also knocked it over and splattered their sandals and pant legs with mud. At the same time, the air became extremely parched, stinging his throat. Naruto managed to grab his canteen before all the water poured out, and then smiled sheepishly at his teammates as they tried to shake the spattered mud off their legs. Neither Shino nor Hinata said anything, but Kurenai finally broke the silence. Should I assume that was an accident, Naruto? Or was that intentional? She asked in a dry tone. I wouldn't prank, Naruto said, and cut himself off. He'd been about to say he wouldn't prank Hinata since she was just now feeling better, but she probably wouldn't appreciate hearing that. Not during a mission, sensei, he said in a formal tone. I see, Kurenai replied. Well, I think it's safe to say that it did not manifest as intended. Do you know why? Naruto shrugged, a little frustrated and embarrassed, but did not answer. Ayano, Hinata said, breaking the silence. Yes, Hinata? Kurenai asked. Naruto, he always tries his best, the girl mumbled, looking down as a blush slowly crept up her cheeks. Naruto noticed her fingers clutching the hem of her jacket, and he wondered why she was so tense. He probably put too much chakra into the, she finally said, lifting her head a little. It didn't go wrong, not really. He just gathered too much water for the canteen to hold. Naruto stared at his teammate, gratified that she wasn't rubbing it in. Really, she was just saying that he did it too well. He was still staring at her when she looked up, and her head shot back down so fast Naruto wondered if he'd just imagined it. That was a very astute observation, Hinata, Kurenai said approvingly. Naruto, the continued, when using a, especially for the first time, it's a good idea to use just the minimum amount of chakra to complete it. Naruto frowned and scratched his head, forgetting for a moment that his hand was wet and a little muddy. How do I know how much to use? He asked, puzzled. Kurenai blinked. As you complete the seals, you should feel a draining sensation as the attempts to draw the necessary chakra. Release just enough chakra for the draining sensation to stop, and no more. Draining sensation? Naruto asked quizzically. What do you mean? Kurenai paused for a long moment before answering. When you use A, don't you feel a slight draining sensation as your chakra goes to fuel the technique? Naruto shook his head, his eyes widening. What does it feel like? Kurenai asked carefully. More like relief, Naruto answered faintly, staring off into the distance. Then he blinked and nodded. It's like when you have to go to the bathroom really badly, and you couldn't for a while, and then when you do, it's really. Naruto's voice trailed off as he shook his head. Hinata was blushing again, and Shino's shoulders appeared to be quivering. Even the corners of Kurenai-sensei's mouth were turning up. It wasn't fair. You did ask me what it felt like, Naruto finally said in exasperation. You are correct, Naruto, he said with a nod. While your choice of metaphor is unfortunate, it is also descriptive. You appear to have larger than normal chakra reserves, which would also explain your ability to use Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. While a large reserve is desirable in a shinobi, most do not develop such a large capacity until after they have mastered basic chakra control techniques. You need to practice limiting how much chakra you allow to flow into your, starting with this one. Water any plants along the roadside that appear to be dried out, and see if you can reduce your effect size until it is comparable to Shino and Hinata's. Naruto nodded, grateful that something useful might come out of this debacle, besides managing to embarrass himself. In the future, Kurenai continued, when we learn new, I'll try to give you an expectation of how much chakra to use, in relation to this one. She smiled. We wouldn't want you to destroy your clothes with a cleansing, would we? Naruto laughed at that mental image, and wondered why Hinata squeaked and looked away. Following his sensei's directions, Naruto spent most of the afternoon eroding various spots along the trail. Hinata watched him closely each time he paused to practice over some particularly parched-looking bush. Oddly enough, though, it didn't make him self-conscious. He supposed he was used to her watching him when they practiced chakra control exercises. Since the water-walking exercise, he hadn't had too many problems with the red chakra. According to Hinata, she could still occasionally see bits of it circulating through his coils where they ran close to the surface of his skin, but they didn't seem to be interfering as much anymore. Given what he knew about the probable source of the oddly colored chakra, Naruto wasn't sure what to make of that. If the stupid fox was aware of what was going on, it might have figured out that ruining Naruto's training just made it more likely they would both die on a mission. But this was a demon, after all, so he wasn't sure he could ascribe normal logic to its actions. Eventually, Naruto figured out how it should feel when he put just enough chakra into the first time he achieved this, Hinata gave him a broad smile, the first genuine one he'd seen from her since they left Konoha, and he promptly lost control of and blasted the poor bush out by its roots. Hinata's face grew so chagrined that Naruto couldn't help but laugh out loud. Hinata looked down again, but eventually recovered and flashed a small grin of her own. You know, Naruto said, as they hustled along the road to get ahead of Kurenai and Shino again, it's nice to be out of Konoha, at least for a little while. Hi, Hinata agreed, nodding slowly. It's one of the nice things about being a shinobi, I guess, he continued. You get to travel a lot, going on missions. Naruto? Hinata asked quietly. Naruto turned toward the girl. Her face had gone very still, and she regarded him with widened eyes. Her mouth opened and closed once, with no sound coming out. Then she swallowed and was able to speak. Did you ever think about leaving Konoha? She asked quietly. As Hinata asked the question he'd asked himself the day before, Naruto felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He'd hoped she hadn't noticed the villagers' hateful eyes, and the way they acted. Their attitude was a little more subdued around his teammates than when he was alone, and he tried to avoid the meaner adults as much as possible when he was with them. He thought he'd pulled it off since neither Shino nor Hinata had asked him about it. But Hinata's question, combined with the look on her face, told him that she knew all too well what was going on. For a moment, Naruto felt exposed, like he'd been caught coming out of the bath. The blonde shinobi didn't need to ask if his face gave away some of his emotions, because Hinata abruptly turned her head. He understood she was trying to avoid embarrassing him, but the reminder that he'd lost control of his facial expression was unwelcome. Jigomen, she said, studying a pine tree that appeared to have been struck by lightning at some point, that is none of my business. You're allowed to ask, Naruto said quickly. I don't know, really. Probably not, he reassured her. Konoha is my home. I can't become Hokage if I leave, can I? Besides, someone has to keep you three entertained with unfortunate metaphors, he added, grinning as she turned back. Hi, she said in a small voice, and seemed to relax a little. Naruto realized she was probably worried about having to break in a new teammate if he ran away from Konoha, which was understandable. Just their luck, they'd be stuck with an idiot like Sasuke who'd be too busy looking cool to actually watch their backs. By the time the sun was setting, Naruto felt like he had a pretty good feel for both the water gathering and how to limit his chakra output. Kurenai led them away from the road for several minutes, until they found a small clearing in which they could pitch their tents. Hinata volunteered to gather stones for a small fire while the others ventured into the woods as Kurenai discussed how they would divide up the necessary tasks. With the assistance of Shino's bugs, the three of them found some rabbits for their evening meal. Kurenai showed them the proper way to clean the animals. By the time they'd brought the dressed meat back to their camp, Hinata had a bright but smokeless fire going inside the sunken fire pit she dug with the folding shovel from Kurenai's pack. It was deep enough that the flames would be invisible from more than a few yards away. Naruto was hopeful when he noticed that Hinata also had several handfuls of greenery that she'd collected. He hoped those were spices, because just eating burnt rabbit didn't appeal to him that much, but with the way Hinata prepared things, he might be looking forward to dinner after all. While Hinata tended the herb-stuffed rabbit sizzling on spits over the sunken fire, Naruto and Shino set up the tent they'd be sharing and Kurenai set up a tent for her and Hinata. By the time they were done, it was fully dark, and the appetizing smells were making Naruto's stomach rumble loudly. When they sat down to eat, Naruto was dismayed to see that there was a field ration bar set out for each of them. Kurenai seemed to note his expression, because she was looking directly at him when she spoke. Eat the rations first, then the rabbit. I'm sure Hinata has done an excellent job, if the smell is any indication, but each bar is designed to contain all the nutrients you should need for a day of high activity, she said. I don't want to see any pieces of them left over. We're going to be a long way from the nearest hospital, so we can't afford for anyone to get sick. Hi, Naruto said in a resigned tone. He picked up the bar, unwrapped it, and crammed it into his mouth with little ceremony. He chewed slowly and, with frequent sips from his canteen, eventually swallowed the pasty mess. Then he let out a sigh and picked up the skewer Hinata had stuck in the ground before him. It smelled even better at close range, especially after the offensively bland ration bar. He paused, noting that everyone else was reaching for their skewers, and nodded toward Hinata and said itadakimasu, with a broad smile. The rabbit skewer lived up to his expectations, and he had to resist the urge to gobble it down. Instead, he ate it slowly, savoring the tasty meat. He glanced up at Hinata, who hadn't touched hers yet, and was instead looking nervously at her teammates. Naruto was amazed when he realized she was worried they wouldn't like it. Hinata! He said suddenly, making her jump. Hi! She squeaked, and Naruto nearly laughed out loud at the expression on her face. What did you use on this rabbit? He asked. Just some herbs I found, she answered hesitantly. Did it turn out bad? She asked, her face falling. No. It's really good, Naruto quickly assured her. I wasn't really looking forward to dinner until I smelled it cooking. Naruto is correct, Hinata, Shino added, making Naruto jump a little when the normally silent boy spoke. It is surprisingly flavorful. Hinata just blinked, and a slow flush crept up her cheeks. They are correct, Hinata, their sensei added. But then she frowned. But that does not mean you should always be stuck with the cooking. We should rotate tasks while we are on a mission. Naruto frowned at his teacher for a moment. Then his eyes widened and he turned toward Hinata. I'll do the wood gathering and water collection when it's your turn if you'll cook when it's my turn, he offered. Shino turned toward Naruto and nodded after a moment's silence. I will take your turn setting up the tents and hunting, he offered. Hinata's blush grew darker, but Kurenai's voice cut in. I expected better from both of you, she said in a frosty tone. Ano-sensei, Hinata said quickly. It's all right. I like to cook. Kurenai didn't say anything else, but she gave both Naruto and Shino several dark looks as they consumed the skewers in silence. As they finished, Naruto gathered up the plates and utensils, and then bowed formally to the seething. Sensei, with your permission, I will demonstrate that I have mastered casting the water gathering at an appropriate strength level. Kurenai eyed him for a moment, but then nodded. Naruto carried the plates off into the woods. As they stepped away from the camp, he said, I don't want to get any of our equipment wet if it misfires or runs down the hill. However, he led his teacher a lot further from the camp than was seemingly necessary. Finally, he stopped and set the plates down on top of an old log and turned back toward Kurenai. Before we do anything else, he began, I'd like to explain why I asked Hinata to trade tasks with me. There's a reason besides feeling like she should cook for you? Kurenai asked coolly, or is there something else? I cook for myself almost every day, Naruto said, scowling a little. But Hinata's really good at it, and I think it'll make her feel better. Kurenai looked a little puzzled. Explain, she said. It didn't really sound like a request either. I'm not really sure why, he admitted, but it just seems to. Maybe because she's so good at it, and she likes to do something she knows she's good at. When we started training together in the evenings, she began bringing these really huge bentos and insisted on sharing her dinner with me. I figured out after a while that she always brought more than enough food for both of us. I never asked her to do it, but she seemed happy when I thanked her. He scratched his head. I'm not sure what happened with her training the night before we left Konoha, but I'm hoping letting her do the cooking will make her feel better. We just need to make sure she knows we like what she makes. Kurenai just looked at him for a long moment. I owe you and Shino an apology, it seems. Naruto just shrugged. But it is true that she'll do a better job than I will, he said, with a small grin. Kurenai smiled as well at his small confession. That was fairly perceptive of you, Naruto, she said approvingly. The boy just shrugged, though his cheeks reddened a little. Maybe, but I'm not perceptive enough to figure out what's going on. There's something wrong, isn't there? He asked. Kurenai took a deep breath. Perhaps, she allowed, but I am not permitted to say. Naruto frowned. I don't know what to do, he finally said. Kurenai thought about his obvious concern for his teammate, and wondered if Hinata had noticed it yet. I think it will come to you, she finally said. Now you are going to demonstrate your mastery of a certain? Naruto shook his head suddenly. Hi, he said as he turned toward the plates and spread them out on the stump. Sway-ton, condensation. He barked as he finished the seals. A stream of water an inch and a half wide shot out of the chakra vortex that appeared in front of Naruto's palm. Though the stream did flow a bit quickly, it nonetheless rinsed off the plates and utensils without scattering them into the undergrowth. Much better, Kurenai said approvingly. Was it difficult to keep it under control? She asked. A little, Naruto admitted. Is it because of you know? Kurenai sighed and nodded. I think so. But try to look at this positively. In the long run, I think it will be easier for you to learn to release chakra in smaller quantities than it would be for one of your classmates to build up a chakra capacity like yours. Naruto frowned. I suppose so, he said slowly. Now I need to figure out the appropriate amounts of chakra to release for every I know. I can help you there, Kurenai assured him. And if you are not overloading them every time you use them, you might find that they will misfire less often. Naruto looked thoughtful as he gathered up the plates. That's why I couldn't make a decent bunshin for my genin exam, wasn't it? But you can produce a horde of Kage bunshin with greater reliability because it requires much more chakra and therefore you aren't overloading the jutsu as badly. That would make sense, she concluded in a thoughtful voice. Sometimes I want to just jam a kunai through that stupid seal, Naruto growled, and see how that damn thing likes being messed with. I do not think that would be a good idea, Kurenai-sensei said in a very quiet voice. Naruto looked up and realized her face had become pale. I don't mean I want to cut my belly, Naruto said quickly. I'm just tired of this thing messing up my life. Then the best revenge is living well, isn't it? Kurenai asked. Naruto looked thoughtful again as he shook the water off the plates and stacked them up. I suppose it would be, he agreed. By the time they returned to the campsite, Shino and Hinata had retired to their respective tents. With the watch rotation, Kurenai was to take the first shift, so Naruto went to his tent. Shino was already in his sleeping bag, with only the top of his head visible. Why exactly do you want Hinata to do all the cooking? I assume there is a reason aside from her considerable skill, the boy said, his voice slightly muffled. I think it might make her feel better, Naruto said as he removed his jacket and unzipped his patched bedroll. He didn't bother to remove the weights. Just make sure you let her know how good it is. It was unusually well prepared, especially given the conditions, Shino agreed. So this is intended to build up her confidence? Naruto was silent for a moment as he stretched out and tried to get comfortable. I suppose so. Something's bugging her though. That family training thing seems sort of messed up. The Hyugas are a highly respected clan, Shino reminded him. Like the Uchihas were? Naruto asked, thinking about their last encounter with Sasuke. Point taken, Shino agreed. The night passed uneventfully, and in the morning they ate the rest of the rabbit. Oddly enough, it was even better cold, and Naruto noticed Hinata blushing a little each time he made a happy sound as they ate. He watched out of the corner of his eye, hamming it up a little, and wondered why he found it so fun to tease the quiet kunoichi. After they broke camp and resumed their journey, Naruto asked his sensei for another to practice as they walked. After a moment's thought, she agreed. But only if he could perform the water-gathering jutsu 10 times without a slip. The first time, he failed on the 9th attempt, but after that he was able to produce 10 without a hitch. Kurenai-sensei agreed that he had, indeed, mastered the along with his teammates, and they took a short break from walking while she demonstrated a new technique. Now this is a combat, she said in a serious voice after showing them the seals. Be very careful how you use it. This was supposedly developed in Cloud Country by shinobi who were very impressed by the Juken techniques. Rather than forcing chakra out of your hands when attacking, this allows you to convert a small amount of chakra into electrical energy, and keep it confined to your hands. If you strike an opponent while this is active, the electrical energy will arc into your target, causing some additional damage. After asking her students some general questions, Kurenai sighed and launched into a lengthy explanation of electricity and how it behaved. Naruto found it a little confusing, but tried to take it all in. After all, he might have to fight someone using electrical attacks someday. So metal armor won't stop it very well, unless it's insulated, Naruto repeated back, and don't use it in water unless I want to shock myself. Kurenai nodded. I can't believe they didn't cover basic physics at the academy. Ano, Hinata asked, is it that important for shinobi? There is no such thing as useless knowledge, Kurenai said in a very serious voice. Then she smiled. While we walk, I will tell you how a lack of such knowledge caused A to be defeated by a very junior chunin. Naruto understood, as his sensei told her story, that she was trying to teach them all something, and probably him in particular. What he didn't understand was why his previous teachers couldn't make their lessons as interesting as she did. He tripped and stumbled twice over ruts in the road, barely catching himself before he hit the ground, as Kurenai described the desperate struggle. When Kurenai's tale reached its conclusion and the wounded female chunin grabbed her opponent's weighted metallic chain and shocked him unconscious, Naruto couldn't help but leap into the air and cheer in a loud voice. I'm gratified that you found the story entertaining, but does anyone remember what we were discussing? Kurenai asked acerbically. Your opponent was ignorant of the conductive properties of steel, Shino replied, and did not understand that every time he attacked you with a metallic weapon, he was inviting an electrical counterstrike. I did not say the kunoichi involved was myself, Kurenai corrected modestly. You were not? I would find it hard to believe someone not involved in the fight could recall the pertinent details, Shino replied in a reasonable tone. Kurenai inclined her head in acknowledgement, but did not speak further. Naruto practiced the seals as they walked. According to Kurenai, they required a minimum chakra 5 times larger than the water-gathering one. However, since the seals required both his hands to perform, Naruto had to discharge the electricity before he could try again. He accomplished this by stepping off the side of the path and slamming his palm into the trunk of the nearest tree. The first time he did this, Naruto was disappointed by how little the tree reacted. The bark was totally unmarked, and he began wondering if he'd put the correct amount of chakra into the technique. So the next time he tried it, he increased the chakra, but it still left the bark unmarked. Naruto frowned and pumped a little more chakra into the next attempt. There was a faint crackle when he slapped the next tree, but no other effect. Naruto scowled in frustration. Right, shocking grasp. He growled and really pushed some chakra into it this time. Now, the palm of his hand glowed with a bright golden light, and a crackling that would drown out angry Kikai bugs filled the air. Naruto let out a whoop and slammed his palm into a tree trunk, even as Kurenai shouted behind him. There was a bright flash, followed by a thunderous crack, and Naruto found himself picked up and flung bodily through the air. He slammed into the ground, knocking the breath out of his lungs as he slid through the undergrowth, wondering why his face hurt. A few minutes later, Naruto was sitting cross-legged on the ground, being lectured. "I can't believe you could be so irresponsible," Kurenai fumed. "You could have killed yourself." "Ah no," Naruto said, wincing as Hinata pulled another splinter out of his cheek. The flash made him screw his eyes shut, which probably saved his eyes. His heavy jacket, gloves, and forehead protector also blocked the majority of the wooden shrapnel. He was glad of that, because the few bits that lodged in his flesh hurt badly enough. "Sensei, why did the tree explode like that? Every time I hit one before that, I didn't even leave a mark." Kurenai stared at him for a moment. "Naruto, trees are grounded. Small electrical charges shouldn't damage them at all." "Then why did that last one explode?" he asked. "Because you put far too much chakra into that technique," she snapped. "So much electrical current passed through the wood that it superheated the sap inside, converting it into steam, and made it explode. That's what happens when lightning strikes a tree." "Really?" Naruto said, smiling despite the blood smeared on his cheeks. Hinata put away her tweezers and silently handed him a damp cloth. "That's great." Kurenai spun on her heel and quickly walked away. "It would be great," Shino observed, "provided you managed to avoid blowing yourself up in the future." "Well, yeah," Naruto said as he wiped off his face. Hinata pulled out a small jar of medicinal cream, but the tiny punctures appeared to have closed on their own. She frowned slightly as she put the jar back into her bag. Naruto stood up and dusted himself off. "Arigato, Hinata-chan." Hinata ducked her head and blushed at the familiar form of address. "Perhaps you should refrain from practicing any more until we reach the border," Shino said as they donned their backpacks. "What are you, sensei, now?" Naruto grumbled. He thought the right Unjutsu had totally kicked, but it wasn't his fault he didn't know trees would explode. "No," Shino replied, "but our orders are to relieve Dereketsu's team before nightfall today, and we're going to be late if there are any more delays." Naruto looked up at the late afternoon sun and cringed. "Let's get moving!" he shouted and set off down the trail again. The sky was beginning to darken in the east when Kurenai called a halt. "What is, sensei?" Naruto asked. He hoped she wasn't going to announce that they had failed. They had to be close to the border by now. "Something," Kurenai said, looking around. "Hinata?" she called out. Naruto spun toward his teammate who'd been on point. She was no longer there. "Hinata!" he yelled. Kurenai cocked her head to the side. "It's subtle, but Naruto. Chakra pulse," she barked. Naruto realized that his sensei must have sensed the genjutsu, and immediately began pushing his chakra inwards, compressing it into a small, hard ball. Whoever had done this must have cast it between Hinata's Byakugan scans. While removing Hinata before she could detect the genjutsu made tactical sense, it still infuriated Naruto. "Naruto Higi, chakra pulse!" He snarled when he felt like he was about to explode. He released the pulse. The trees around them wavered as the chakra shockwave passed through them. 3 of the trees were replaced by figures in dark cloaks. An arm protruded from one of the cloaks, holding up Hinata, who sagged limply like she was asleep. Naruto was about to charge forward when Hinata's eyes shot open and her body twisted. Her hands flashed toward her captor's arm, and suddenly she was spinning through the air like a doll thrown by a careless child. Hinata twisted in midair, stabilizing her tumble, and managed to land in a crouch next to Shino. Naruto stepped forward, his hands falling into a familiar seal. "Kage Bunishin no," he began, but stopped when he felt Kurenai's hand grip his shoulder. How had she gotten behind him so quickly? "Aren't you a little old for playing games, Dereketsu?" his sensei asked in a very disapproving voice. The middle figure snorted and threw back his hood. Dark hair was drawn back into a short ponytail, and even darker eyes glared contemptuously. They have you on babysitting duty, Yuhi? He drawled, smirking. Naruto ground his teeth together, but felt Kurenai's hand tighten even further on his shoulder and subsided. Her fingernails felt sharp. Hardly, Kurenai replied in a frosty tone. You've been recalled to Konoha, she said as she pulled the red-sealed scroll out of her vest and tossed it to the shinobi. The man's eyes widened. Is this some kind of joke? He asked as he cracked open the seal with a small flash of chakra. No, Kurenai replied. The Hokage is tired of your bumbling. You're supposed to be securing the border, not provoking the IWA ninjas for your own amusement. And you and these brats are going to do a better job? Have you lost your mind? Deriketsu demanded, his face growing redder by the second. We are more than sufficient to achieve our objectives, Kurenai said coolly. The man snorted. The smallest I've ever seen, one of those bug users, and is that him? He asked. Naruto felt his stomach drop and he watched his teammates from the corner of his eye. He wanted to jump this idiot and pound him before he said any more, but Kurenai-sensei's hand was like an iron band around his shoulder. Yes, this is the infamous prankster Uzumaki Naruto, though his pranking days seem to be over, Kurenai replied. He understands that shinobi are bound by the Hokage's laws, no matter where they are. Deriketsu's eyes narrowed as they flickered from Naruto to his teammates. He turned his head and spat. Fine, we will report to the Hokage. Try not to get murdered in your sleep by some bloodthirsty animal, he said in a sardonic tone. Bran, Chuzai, let's strike camp and leave these shinobi to their mission. The sooner we leave, the sooner we get some warm sake in us. A wind sprang out of nowhere, causing their cloaks to flap in the mysterious breeze. Then they were gone, with only a swirling torrent of wind-blown leaves to mark their place. Baka, Naruto growled. Chapter 7. Because they were to patrol a couple of miles within the border, Team 8 was required to set up their own camp well back from the boundary with the land of Earth. Kurenai merely shook her head when their first patrol discovered the subtle traces of Deriketsu's camp. They had claimed a small clearing within sight of the actual border. Naruto supposed the Hokage had been right, those Bakas were spoiling for a fight if they did that. Naruto tried to pay close attention to how Kurenai-sensei had them do things, because there was almost always a reason behind it, like the way they randomly varied their patrol patterns to make it harder for someone to slip by them undetected. It was embarrassing, but sometimes he did have to ask her why. At least she didn't berate him for being stupid when she answered his questions. Instead, she seemed pleased that he wanted to know. Not knowing why she did this began to bother him until he finally had to ask her about that as well. Some instinct made him wait until Hinata and Shino were sparring after dinner, because he wasn't sure what the answer would be. Kurenai kept her eyes on her students as they fought. Running the patrols was helping their speed and endurance, but she said she still wanted them to train a little when they took breaks. If their bodies were too tired, she would go into what Naruto recognized as her lecture mode and talk to them about things they needed to know. Those were usually interesting, but it was another time when she also welcomed questions. Why was this so? Ano-sensei, Naruto said in a low voice as Hinata slapped aside Shino's punch and made a strike toward his midsection that forced him to quickly backpedal. She still wore the weights, but they were slowing her down less and less. He wondered if she even noticed this. What is it, Naruto? Kurenai replied. I've been asking a lot of questions lately, he said, but his voice trailed off. How could he say this without sounding like a baka? Yes, she said, her eyes still on the combatants. I'm glad you've been taking a more active role in learning strategy and tactics. But that's just it, Naruto said, the words tumbling out easier now. Why are you so happy that I'm asking all these questions? Almost all the teachers at the academy get mad when I ask questions. Everyone but Irika? She asked softly. Shino used his greater reach to force Hinata to retreat again. Naruto shrugged. Irika's different. He grew up without parents like I did, so he cut me a break. No, Kurenai said firmly, he's not. He's doing his job properly. Evidently, he's one of the few instructors that is. Nani? Naruto asked, his eyebrows drawn together in confusion. Kurenai sighed. Naruto, why do you ask those questions? Are you seeking attention? Are you trying to delay me so I don't start talking about a new subject? Or are you simply trying to irritate me? No, sensei, Naruto said quickly, I just asked because I wanted to know. Exactly, Kurenai murmured as Hinata leapt over Shino's leg sweep. A student that actually wants to learn is a blessing to a teacher. Why should I want to discourage that? But why didn't the instructors want? Naruto's voice trailed off. It's because of me, isn't it? He asked coldly. Not precisely, Kurenai said in a voice little more than a whisper. Naruto, I'm not going to excuse their behavior, but I think it might help you to understand. When the Kyuubi attacked, it was like a natural disaster. It was unstoppable. I was miles away from the battle and I could still feel it. More chakra and killing intent than I'd ever imagined was possible to exist. I'd never been more afraid in my life, and I imagine that was true for everyone else in Konoha. Then it was defeated, but at the cost of Yandame's life. It's hard to explain how much we all loved the fourth Hokage, but I think any one of us would have given their lives in his place, were it possible. But then he was gone, and so was the demon responsible for his death. Everyone was angry and grieving for the Hokage and everyone else who died, and there was no real outlet for that grief and rage. I know the third and fourth Hokages wanted you to be seen as the savior of the village, but I don't think it was possible, not with everyone still full of rage. Especially since there was really only one obvious outlet for that rage. Me, Naruto finished her sentence dully. After another quick exchange of blows, Hinata and Shino sprang apart, panting. It's hard to break an ingrained habit, Kurenai said, slipping into her lecture mode for a moment, but once someone does manage to see the real Naruto, they don't go back to seeing you as a demon, do they? No, they don't, Naruto said with a sigh. But I was at the academy for years, and it seems like Irika is the only one that bothered. All of the other instructors were just trying to get back at my prisoner by making me feel stupid. As I said, I will not excuse their behavior, Kurenai agreed, but I also know that Irika really does care about you. When he heard about the spy, he thought I'd ordered you to fight until I explained. He looked like he wanted to kill me. Naruto was mortified that Irika almost attacked another shinobi because of him, especially A. Oddly enough, he also felt a strange warmth to know that the man cared about him that much. Jigomen, he choked out, apologizing. No need for apologies, Kurenai said. I'm glad to see the truth of his feelings. We had a very productive conversation, and I think I may be able to call him a friend in the future. But do you realize why my attitude toward questions may be somewhat at odds with what you have previously experienced? Naruto looked puzzled for a moment, and then nodded. Because the others wanted me to stay ignorant and fail as a ninja, that was the only means they could see for getting even with the Kyuubi. That is an accurate summation, Kurenai said as Hinata landed a solid hit on Shino's shoulder, making him stumble backwards. Understanding and teasing apart the motivations of others, based upon indirect observations, is a valuable skill to cultivate for a shinobi. Even more so for a Hokage. Everything is a lesson with you, isn't it? Naruto asked, half-jokingly. Of course, Kurenai replied softly as she stood up. We have a lot of ground to make up, and I am responsible for your education now. Naruto blinked as he absorbed that statement. He barely listened as Kurenai gave a detailed critique of the sparring match they just watched together. Things were quiet, at least at first. When Kurenai was satisfied that their stamina and chakra reserves were up to the task, they began following their patrol routes through the tree cover rather than on the ground. After mastering the water walking exercises, using chakra to keep their footing on tree branches was easy. Before the day was over, they were leaping from tree to tree, subtly boosting their leg strength with small amounts of chakra to improve their leaping distance. Even with his weights, Naruto could make a 20-meter jump from a standing start, without really straining himself. He did, however, make sure he aimed for branches that were sturdy enough to handle his extra weight. Getting dumped on his head once was enough. While this method was faster, Kurenai cautioned them to not use it in hostile territory, or when they feared they would be ambushed. It was damned hard to dodge a thrown kunai when you were in mid-leap, and landing on an explosive tag can ruin your whole day. With a little subtle begging, Naruto also persuaded Kurenai to show them some more. It had been embarrassing to admit it at first, but she also showed him why he had so many problems using the body substitution technique, Kawarimi no Jutsu. It worked sometimes, like when he ambushed Sasuke's team, but it failed more often than not. As he suspected, he'd been throwing far too much chakra into the technique, which surprised him at first. He thought moving your body in the blink of an eye, and replacing it with a nearby object would take a lot of energy. Kurenai-sensei merely shook her head and explained that if the common shinobi technique required as much chakra as he used, it would kill anyone weaker than who tried it. It was a little disturbing to realize just how much more chakra he had available than others, normal ninjas. Of course, as Kurenai pointed out, as bad as his chakra control was, he wasted so much that it wasn't that obvious. But in the same breath she promised to work with him until he was as efficient as she was. Naruto couldn't wait, he wanted to show everyone that he wasn't just empty boasts. Kurenai's repertoire of ninjutsu seemed somewhat eclectic. She seemed to know techniques from a variety of styles. Sensei reiterated her motto of there is no such thing as useless knowledge when Shino asked her about it as she introduced them to a doton. Doton, Wana lets one mold chakra to influence the ground around their target. It required you to touch the ground as you released the molded chakra. But making the earth flow up around the target's feet, slowing them down or trapping them, was really useful if used correctly. This was especially tricky for Naruto, because if he molded too much chakra into the technique, the ground would liquefy around Kurenai's feet, letting her merely step out of it. Fortunately, all the practice he'd had getting Suiton, Gyushu under control paid off here, and he mastered it almost as soon as Shino and Hinata. He was a little puzzled when he finally got it right. Hinata was trying to apologize for something, but when he asked her what she did wrong, she wouldn't tell him. Remembering Kurenai's words, he just shrugged and smiled at her. Whatever you did, I'm not mad at you. You're a good person, Hinata, so I know you'd never do something to be mean. For some reason, she spun around and quickly walked away. Naruto turned to Shino with a questioning expression, but the bug user wouldn't say anything. Again, Naruto had the oddest feeling that Shino was smirking at him. He hoped Kurenai would introduce a katon next, so he could accidentally burn the collar off of Shino's jacket. On the second week of the patrol, Hinata's Byakugan caught traces of swift movement at the edges of her range. They changed courses to track what had to be a shinobi and followed it all the way back to the border. As quick as they were, it still crossed back over the border before they could catch it, and Kurenai called a halt when they were still several meters short of the invisible boundary. Naruto noticed they were standing near the clearing that Dereketsu's team had used as a campsite. At the other end of the clearing, on the earth side of the border, were 4 figures that seemed to be around Kurenai's height. Naruto wondered which one had violated their border to lead them here. He looked left and right, his nostrils flaring, wary of an ambush. Hinata's Byakugan were active, and some slight motion in the grass around Shino's feet meant his bugs were deploying as well. A few seemed to have taken to the air after moving well away from their host. Have we satisfied your curiosity? Kurenai called out. Somewhat, the largest of the 4 rock ninjas replied. They were all dressed in tans and neutral grays, and the lower portions of their faces were covered as well. I'm somewhat insulted that Konoha sends a group of children to match us. We are not here to contest with you, Kurenai said firmly. The Hokage does not want any more incidents along this border. Dereketsu was recalled for that reason. That's too bad, the rock leader yelled back with an evil laugh. He was fun to bait, if a bit too predictable. Naruto didn't really want to draw attention to himself, but he'd become rather warm during the extended chase through the trees. He slowly unzipped his heavy jacket so the cool morning air could cool him down. As slight as that motion was, it still drew the attention of the rock shinobi. Naruto froze as he felt sudden spikes of killing intent radiating from across the clearing. His ears strained to catch the whispered words exchanged between the IWA ninjas, but he could barely make out a few, such as bastard, flash, and yellow. It really didn't make a lot of sense to him, but he froze in place, not wanting to provoke anything more until Kurenai said the word. I see your mission is not as innocent as I would have believed, the rock leader called out as they split up and disappeared into the trees. You will not catch us unaware when you come for our blood. Back into the trees, Kurenai hissed. Naruto waited until Shino and Hinata were halfway there before he began backing out of the clearing. His senses seemed extraordinarily sharp, and he could almost hear the individual blades of grass flex under his sandals. As he slipped through the trees, Kurenai caught his eye. Her frown faded as he quickly glanced at Shino and Hinata, verifying their positions. She nodded and motioned for them to follow her. As previously arranged, Hinata sped up until she was even with Kurenai. Her Byakugan was active and checked their path for ambushes or traps. Shino trailed behind them, and Naruto was a little farther back. If any of his team were attacked, he was in a position to see it immediately and counterattack. If he was targeted, Hinata's all-around vision would let them know as well. Kurenai-sensei led them on a circuitous route, doubling back many times to check for pursuers. Nothing more dangerous than a frightened deer was found, so eventually they returned to their camp. Ayano-sensei, Hinata said as soon as they stopped. What happened back there? I'm not completely sure, Kurenai said, frowning. Their sudden aggressiveness is worrying, Shino said gravely. Naruto could only nod in agreement. I could read their lips, a little, through their masks, Hinata said, blushing. What does yellow flash mean? Kurenai stiffened at Hinata's words, and then she turned and peered closely at Naruto. I suppose if they saw him at a distance, and no real clues for gauging his height, she murmured. She let out a sigh as all three of her genins frowned at her in confusion. All right, I think I know what that was, they said. You've all seen the carving of the fourth Hokage on the cliff overlooking Konoha, right? They nodded. Well, from a distance, Naruto bears a passing resemblance to Yondaime, she continued. Did he have yellow hair like I do? Naruto interrupted. Yes, Kurenai replied. And because of that, and a special of his, he was often known as the Yellow Flash of Konoha. But why would Naruto's resemblance to the fourth Hokage cause such a reaction? Shino asked before Naruto could. Kurenai took a deep breath and sat down on a log they'd moved near the fire pit. Well, as you know, there was a war between Konoha and the hidden village of Stone back before you were born. She paused for a moment, while they all nodded. Before becoming the Hokage, the Yondaime was a who fought in many battles. He was known for his clever plans and skillful leadership. It is suspected that the rock leaders knew of this, and wanted to draw him out. Shinobi historians don't know for sure that the IWA ninjas specifically targeted his students, but we do know that one was killed, an Uchiha named Obito. Kurenai paused, taking a deep breath. Whatever they hoped to accomplish by killing the fourth student, it did not succeed. After his remaining students returned to Konoha to recover, he returned to the battlefields and by the end of the war, over half of the shinobi of the Wagakure had fallen to the Yellow Flash and the attacks he led. Naruto felt his mouth drop open in shock. That wasn't something they'd lectured about at the academy. He killed half of the whole village? He asked in shock. The shinobi, yes. We were at war, Kurenai said gravely, and that's what happens in a war. Some people think Sandaime is weak because he favors peace. I call them fools. Naruto shook his head. They can't really believe I'm the fourth Hokage, can they? I mean, that's crazy. Kurenai shook her head. No, those scared people often believe irrational things. But they may think you were sent specifically to intimidate or provoke them. I don't think the Hokage anticipated this reaction when he assigned us this mission. Hopefully, they will be encouraged to stay on their own side of the border for now. If they do not, I will know, Shino added. They stood there long enough for at least one of my allies to climb onto each of them. Those were female Kakai bugs, so I will quickly know if they get within scent range of one of my sentries. Very good, Shino, Kurenai said with a smile. While they initiated this encounter by crossing over into Fire Country territory, we have gained far more than they in the exchange. Naruto remembered Kurenai's words and tried to stay optimistic as he gathered wood for the cook fire. The thought of the heroic Yondaime killing people made him feel ill, but Kurenai was right, it was a war, and he supposed he didn't have much choice. And neither would he, if war broke out again. He wondered who those fools were that Kurenai had talked about, and resolved to be a little nicer to the Hokage next time he saw the old man. The blonde-haired genin went about his chores, but he would think back on this conversation many times in the years to come. The first hint of trouble came from Hinata, whose head snapped around while they were on a routine patrol. Sensei! She hissed. Naruto, who was in the process of leaping toward the next tree, caught himself with one foot still touching bark, so he increased the chakra in that foot and awkwardly recoiled back onto the bough. Hinata was looking to the right of their current course. They are under A, she said as she shook herself and suddenly launched forward. Naruto watched 4 dark objects drop toward the forest floor from where she'd been standing and knew she'd discarded her weights. Hinata! Kurenai barked, reaching toward the Hyuga genin. Naruto wanted to follow, but he knew he needed to see what was going on. Naruto Majutsu, Chakra Pulse! He growled as he hurriedly crammed chakra into his hara, and then practically hurled it in the direction Hinata had jumped. The recoil nearly blew him backward out of the tree, and the bough his feet were chakra glued to creaked alarmingly. But the ripple sped outwards, knocking a few leaves from the trees like a stiff breeze, and making several figures shimmer into view under a tree in the distance. 3 adult-sized shapes swam into view, 2 of them carrying large bundles. Naruto had no idea who these men were, or why Hinata was attacking them, but he wasn't going to let her go alone. He jumped after her, Shino and Kurenai barely a step behind. Kaige Bunshin no Jutsu, Naruto called out, his hands forming the familiar seal sequence as he dropped toward the men. The 3 of them were joined by a score of clones. The man on the left dropped his cloth-wrapped burden and began making seals, his fingers a blur. Katan, Garando Fenikusakachu, he snapped, and a trio of fireballs sprang from his fingertips. They spiraled outwards, leaving trails of fire that grew ever wider as they spread. Shino and Kurenai avoided the worst of it, but the vortex of flames had been aimed directly at Naruto and his clones. Naruto threw his arms in front of his face at the last moment, and tried to shift his chakra to protect his face. The heat that washed over him was intense, and he didn't need to hear the multiple pops to know his clones had been destroyed. When he broke through the funnel of fire, the cool air beyond was incredibly sweet. He dropped to the ground in a crouch as he spread his arms again. His face felt tight and hot, and the smell of scorched hair was unbelievably foul, but he was basically in one piece. "Damn, Kuro, you're slipping," the largest of the strangers said. "I thought you were going to cook that little bastard for dinner." He was tall and heavily muscled, and wore only loose pants and heavy boots. His shaved head shone in the sunlight that filtered through the trees, and his cold black eyes gleamed like chips of obsidian. The man on the right wore a blue and black uniform that contrasted with the fire user's red and black one. He was fending off Hinata with a staff made of gleaming ice, but was having some difficulty handling the weapon while trying to juggle the large bundle he was also burdened with. Finally, he growled in exasperation and threw his bundle into the air and swung the staff at Hinata crosswise with both hands. The staff was little more than a blur, but the Hyuga was even faster as she leapt upward, grabbing onto the bundle with both hands and swinging it onto her back as their combined momentum spun her into a tree trunk. Naruto gaped as her feet found purchase on the rough bark and she ran up the trunk in a continuous motion. She angled toward a large branch and began running along the underside of it without even slowing down. "Damn it, we can't let them delay us. Kill them all," the large shinobi barked. An instant later, his hand flashed upward and deflected the kunai Kurenai had thrown at his face. "With pleasure, Taisho," Kuro snarled, his hands flashing through seals again. "Katan, Kin Hashaki no!" he said, and a blot of flame shot from his hands toward the still smoldering Naruto. "Suetun, Gyushu!" Naruto snapped as he ran through the seals. It was a little tricky, trying to align the condensation vortex along a vertical plane instead of a horizontal one, but he didn't have to worry so much about holding back his chakra this time. A spinning chakra vortex a foot wide opened up and the air around them became parched of moisture as a blast of water erupted like a fire hose, intercepting the flame blast. Naruto looked away, blinking rapidly, as steam blasted across the battlefield. There was a loud grunt of pain that brought a fierce grin to his lips. He hadn't missed. A flash of motion drew his eyes to the side. When Hinata reached the end of the bough, she didn't even slow down and instead launched herself toward the ground. She twisted in midair so that she absorbed the impact with her legs, cradling the bundle as she sank into a low crouch. A kunai flashed and the fabric parted to reveal a young girl, bound and gagged, with furious white eyes like Hinata's. "The other bundle is Konohamaru-kun," Hinata said as she quickly cut her sister's bonds. Kurenai's eyes widened and she turned toward the package Kuro had discarded, but Naruto was even faster. His fist snapped up and he struck himself a sharp blow on each shoulder, and then threw his arms forward. From under the sleeves of his jacket, his forearm weights flew forward and struck the large ninja in the face, staggering him backward. The discarded weights fell to the ground, where they embedded themselves in the soft forest loam. In a flash, Naruto was running past the leader, whose fist made a crater in the ground inches behind him. Naruto silently thanked Guy and Lee as he grabbed the other bundle and slung it toward his sensei. Kurenai caught it without missing a beat, her kunai already moving. Things were moving rapidly, too rapidly for him to keep track of. The guy with the ice staff was closing in to reclaim his prize, but Hinata stepped over her sister, leaving her a kunai to finish freeing her legs, and set herself in his path. The staff flashed forward, but this time she was ready, and shattered it with a Juken strike. A sharp shard left a line of blood along her cheek, and Naruto bared his teeth in a feral snarl. A ball of chakra-enhanced fire struck him in the back, knocking him to his knees as it tried to ignite the tough jacket material. Naruto somersaulted forward, feeling blisters rise on the back of his neck. He raised himself into a handstand, looking behind him. Kuro was starting another set of hand seals, but a volley of kunai from Kurenai made him abort that attack and leap backwards. Naruto saw the thrown knives embed themselves up to the rings in the earth, and silently reminded himself never to get his sensei mad. He flexed his arms and launched himself into the air, marveling at how much easier this was with half of his weights gone. He struck the quick-release catches for the leg weights as he tumbled, and then snapped his legs out straight to launch them at the flame user. Kuro jumped backward to avoid those as well, hissing in frustration. But his annoyance was brought up short when a mass of Kikai bugs swarmed up his legs and Shino's right arm wrapped around his neck, laying a kunai across the front of his throat. The fire user's eyes widened and he froze in place. "Good one, Shino!" Naruto crowed, then turned back toward the big guy. The leader was moving to help the Ice Nin with Hinata. "Hey team! I ain't done with you! Doton wanna!" He slapped the ground and the soil under the large man's feet writhed and flowed up over his boots. The largest ninja caught himself as he started to stumble. Then he turned toward Naruto and smiled. His skin took on a metallic sheen and his feet began to sink inches deeper into the ground. With a heave, he tore his feet free of the earth snare and began striding toward the much smaller green-clad shinobi. "Naruto! No!" a shrill voice yelled. Roughed as it was from the gag and whatever else he'd been through, Naruto could still recognize Konohamaru's voice. "Don't! He killed Iruka-sensei!" Naruto froze in place. He couldn't move, could breathe. He didn't just hear that. He couldn't have. It was impossible. He felt the blood rushing in his ears as his fingers curled into claws. His blood was turning into fire in his veins as his mind shut down. He saw Hinata hesitate, jumping back from the ice user and turning toward him, her eyes wide. A quick from the blue-clad ninja launched a volley of ice shards at the Hyuga. Her Byakugan still active, Hinata avoided or blocked most of them, but the last one struck the side of her head. She dropped to the ground. Kurenai's hands were a blur as she launched a volley of. The Ice Nin dodged and blocked, but still ended up with one jammed into his shoulder. Kurenai charged at him with a blade in each hand. "Get out of here! Run!" she shouted at the children who were gingerly climbing to their feet. Konohamaru grabbed the Hyuga girl's hand and they ran into the forest. "Now!" the leader said as he stomped toward Naruto, beginning to pick up speed. A sudden roar of flames from behind him made Naruto turn, even as he spun away from a fist that nearly flattened him as it drove into the ground. "I don't need to use seals to do this one, boy." Kuro smirked as his body was wreathed in flames. There was a loud crackling sound as Shino's Kikai bugs were incinerated. Shino himself was blown backwards off his feet, his right arm a mass of flames. Naruto continued sidestepping, trying to keep both of the bastards in front of him, and lead them away from Shino and Hinata. The fire user didn't seem to be that interested in Shino, because he began flicking small fireballs at Naruto, making him jump to the side as they ignited the parched grass. Shino rolled over and over in the grass, eventually smothering the flames as he rolled away from the clearing. The right sleeve of his jacket was burned away, and what Naruto could see of his arm was a mass of red that didn't look good at all. Against all reason, Shino tried to struggle to his feet, holding himself up with his good hand. The ever-present sunglasses gone, the Aburain boy locked gazes with Naruto for a moment. Then his hazel eyes rolled back into his head. He slowly toppled forward and was still. "Come on," the leader said. "Cook this little brat, and then we can triple-team the job and then get out of here." "I'd like to take my time with her and the girl," the flame-wreathed ninja leered, "but it shall be as you command. Stand still, boy, and I'll make this quick." Naruto froze in place. The thought of these two hurting his sensei and Hinata finished a process that began with Konohamaru's shout, and gathered momentum as he watched Hinata and Shino fall. He felt something snap inside. "I'll kill you!" he screamed and charged toward Kuro, whose eyes were suddenly wide. Everything seemed to be covered by a red haze, and Naruto vaguely realized that Kyuubi's red chakra was exploding out of his skin. He wondered if this meant the seal was breaking, but he didn't really care as long as it meant he could stop them from hurting his friends. The fire user hurled fireball after fireball at the short ninja, who suddenly didn't seem so ridiculous an opponent. The pronounced whisker marks the boy could feel etching deeper into his face probably had something to do with that, along with the pronounced canines that were starting to draw blood from his lower lip. Naruto batted the flaming missiles aside with contempt, ignoring the sting in his palms that disappeared almost as soon as it registered. As he leapt onto him, Kuro finished a series of frantic seals. Katan, Okibi Shanetsu Jigoku. He screamed as flames exploded outward from his body. Naruto crashed through the flaming shockwave, feeling it as little more than a warm breeze through the haze of rage and the red chakra that seemed to feed it. He landed on Kuro and drove the shinobi to his knees as his hands locked around the bastard's throat. The man's hands tore at his wrists, but Naruto's arms could not be moved. The firestorm around them gained in strength as the man's struggles grew more frenzied. Naruto grinned, enjoying the weak man's terror, but a flash of light gray in the corner of his vision seemed to nag at something in his mind. With a wrench, Naruto turned his eyes away from the intoxicating terror in the man's eyes and looked to his left. The firestorm, heightened by mortal terror, was still expanding. Kurenai and the Ice Nin, still locked in mortal combat, were forced to move away, but the flames were also creeping toward Hinata's unconscious body. Naruto felt like he'd been dunked in ice water. His head snapped back around and he snapped the fire ninja's neck with one quick motion. He turned toward Hinata, but the metallic ninja was in his way, his face twisted into a rictus of hate. An enormous fist cocked back and rocketed toward Naruto's face, but he simply raised one hand and caught it. The man grunted and slammed his foot into Naruto's stomach, picking him up and throwing backward into a half-burned tree trunk. "I don't know what kind of freak power you have," he snarled, "but I can turn my skin into solid steel. You have as little chance of defeating me as that stupid teacher that tried to protect those brats. I'm going to crush you, and then your leader, and then I'll kill your little friends before I collect my prize, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." Rather than standing, Naruto raised himself onto all fours, balanced on his fingertips and the balls of his feet. In a flash, he drove forward, sending gouts of churned earth flying into the air behind him. The metallic ninja laughed and launched himself forward as well, his fist poised to crush the runty brat who dared kill one of his men. There was a loud crunch as the two collided, and dust and debris filled the air around them. As it settled, one could see where a huge fist had smashed into the ground, flattening everything under it as it made a crater nearly 6 feet across. A much smaller fist could be seen protruding from the broad metallic back. Blood poured out of the wound, joining the growing pool beneath the crouching giant. Smeared with blood and dirt, Naruto levered himself out from between the dead man's arm and his legs. He managed to beat the punch, letting it land harmlessly behind him as he slammed his fist through the bastard's chest, but he hadn't changed back from steel with death, and he was heavy as hell. The blonde genin finally squirmed free and looked for his sensei. The ice user, whom Kurenai recognized from the bingo book as Lasuk the Ice Knife, was surprisingly skillful with his created weapons, and they'd exchanged over a dozen blows before Kurenai was fatally distracted by the burst of killer intent radiating from her genin. Was Kyubi about to break free after all? Seizing his chance, the ice user bound her feet in ice. She instantly threw her kunai at him, but he'd anticipated that and ducked them easily. Another Hayatan bound her arms at her sides, rendering her helpless. But rather than immediately kill his helpless opponent, the Ice Nin watched in shock as the blonde brat exploded with a ferocious red chakra and killed both Kuro the Flame and Kazuyo the Anvil. Turning toward the boys, and now his best ticket to getting out of this alive, he laid the point of his ice sword alongside her throat and hoarsely asked her the question burning in his mind: what the hell was that? The answer came from an unexpected direction, a whisper from behind his ear as the helpless in front of him wavered and disappeared. "Kyubi no Kitsune," was all it said, sounding almost scared. It was the second to last thing he ever heard. The last was the dull scrape of sharp steel on bone as a kunai was rammed into the base of his skull. Naruto breathed a sigh of relief as Kurenai-sensei's wavered and faded out, and the last of the kidnappers fell like a puppet with its strings cut. As the red haze disappeared, he suddenly felt horribly tired and sore. After a moment, it was all he could do to stay on his feet. "Naruto?" Kurenai asked in a quiet voice. "Hi, sensei," he answered. "Something weird happened. I think it started to get out or something." He shuddered violently. If Kyubi was in danger of breaking out, he jumped when Kurenai put her hand on his shoulder. Why was she willing to stand so close to him? Kurenai looked him in the eyes as she slowed her breathing and seemed to gather her thoughts. Naruto, she began, from what the Hokage told me, your seal was designed to let some of Kyuubi's chakra filter out into your own. Apparently you drew on that when you became afraid. Naruto nodded, not bothering to correct her. He hadn't been afraid, he'd been furious. If I'm not going to go insane and kill everyone, can we check on Hinata and Shino? I'll take care of that, Kurenai said as she knelt down next to Hinata. Can you track down Sarutobi Konohamaru and Hyuga Hanabi? Naruto nodded and took a deep breath. Konohamaru! He yelled. Yeah? A voice echoed from the trees nearby. Naruto shrugged at Kurenai, who had turned toward him, scowling. He never does what he's told to do, Naruto explained. All right, Kurenai said. If you know him, reassure him that everything is all right, and keep an eye on Hinata. I think she's just stunned, and I need to see Shino. Naruto nodded and slumped down next to his teammate. He was worried about Shino's arm, but Hinata looked so still, lying there like that. Naruto? Konohamaru whispered. Naruto looked up, but he couldn't immediately see the little brat. Maybe he wasn't so bad at the camouflaging art when it was for real. It's safe to come out, Naruto said wearily. We got them. We got them all. They won't be hurting anyone ever again. He tried to push Iruka-sensei out of his mind, but it wouldn't cooperate. He'd never get to treat him to ramen like he promised himself he would, damn it. The bushes to his left stirred and Konohamaru cautiously stepped back into the clearing, still leading the little girl who must be Hinata's sister. The wide-eyed girl looked at Hinata's unconscious form with a curious lack of interest. She'll be okay, Naruto reassured her, she just got hit on the head. I'm not surprised she was defeated, the girl said in a clear voice. Her accent was cultured like Hinata's, but the coldness of her words made Naruto scowl. She was not defeated, Naruto snarled, angrily biting off each word. She charged in there and rescued you, achieving her objective. The ninjas that kidnapped you are dead and we're all alive. We won. Konohamaru glanced uneasily from his rival to his fellow kidnapping victim. Ah, that's good, Naruto-san. I'm glad Kurenai-sama was able to defeat them. Naruto sat for a moment, looking down at Hinata. What happened to Iruka-sensei? He asked quietly. Konohamaru looked down. After a moment he sniffed loudly. I'm sorry, Naruto. They grabbed me at recess, but I saw them at the last moment and called out. Sensei tried to stop them, but the big one hit him so hard, I heard his bones break. But Sensei kept trying to get up again. Naruto closed his eyes, remembering how Iruka fought so hard to save him from Mizuki. That sounds just like him. The big one kept hitting him until he stopped moving. I was tied up and couldn't do anything, but they made me watch before they put me in the sack. Sensei wasn't breathing, the boy sobbed. He should have been stronger if he was going to interfere, the girl snapped. If he'd been properly trained, he would have stopped them and they wouldn't have gotten away with either of us. You shut your mouth! Konohamaru shouted at the younger girl, making her flinch back like she'd been slapped. Her face went red and her eyes narrowed. How dare you! Do you know who I am? The girl snarled. He's the Hokage's grandson, so I believe he outranks you, Naruto snapped, not even counting the fact that you are an awful brat. I can't believe you are Hinata's sister, or that she'd even bother to try and rescue you. His revulsion and grief at what had happened was rapidly turning into anger, and this spoiled brat who bad-mouthed Hinata and Iruka-sensei was really asking for it. He swallowed his anger with great difficulty, and looked down at Hinata. Her breathing was slow and even. Concentrating on that seemed to calm him. He failed to protect his teammates, but at least none of them had died. Shino might be badly hurt though. As his stomach twisted with worry, he heard footsteps approaching. Naruto silently rolled to his feet, bringing his hands up in a taijutsu stance. Konohamaru inhaled sharply, staring at Naruto's right arm. Previously concealed behind the genin's torso, it was coated with drying blood up to the shoulder. Naruto wearily released his breath, and nearly dropped to his knees when Kurenai helped Shino limp into the clearing. There were bandages wrapped around his right forearm, and the sleeve of his red shirt was scorched and seared where it protruded from the right armhole of his jacket. Naruto blinked. Seeing that unexpectedly bright red shirt at a distance, he thought Shino's arm had been burned far worse than it was. He felt a small smile tug at his mouth, the first since they'd left for patrol that morning. Hinata stirred at last, rolling onto her side and clutching her head. Naruto carefully pulled a cloth from his belt with his left hand, wetted it down with his canteen, and wiped at the clotted blood along Hinata's hairline. His teammate's eyes shot open and she winced in pain. "It's all right, Hinata," Naruto said. "We got them. Your sister and Konohamaru are safe." Hinata seemed to relax slightly at this news. "My name is Hanabi," the younger girl snapped irritably. "Your name will be Face in Mud if you don't shut up," Naruto replied with a glare. It's all right, Naruto," Hinata said quietly. "Hanabi, were you injured?" No, thanks to you. Father will be furious when he finds out you were the first to fall." Naruto thought the girl derived some weird sort of satisfaction from this pronouncement. Hinata sat up quickly, and Naruto noticed she bit her lower lip and shut her eyes for a moment. He glared at Hanabi, but the girl didn't comment. What the hell was going on with these two? Hinata slowly climbed to her feet. Naruto thought she was barely keeping her balance, but some impulse kept him from reaching out to steady her. "If you are unhurt, we should probably return to our camp to regroup," she said. "That might be a good idea," Kurenai said, glancing over at Naruto. "But we should moderate our pace for our guests." They set out for their camp, walking slowly along the forest floor. After a few minutes, Naruto felt his energy returning and he no longer had to concentrate to avoid stumbling. Of course, putting his weights back on didn't help the situation. Shino was right in front of him, along with the two young children, both of whom seemed to be a little afraid of the quiet Bugnin. Hinata was in the lead with Kurenai. "Hinata," Kurenai said, her voice carrying through the still air. "I understand that you were concerned about rescuing your sister, but do you think it might have been better if we devised a plan before attacking the kidnappers?" "Jigomen sensei," Hinata said, ducking her head apologetically. "I would have preferred to have done that," she continued, her voice clearer than it usually was when she was embarrassed and apologizing. "But there wasn't time. As fast as they were moving, if we didn't immediately intercept them, they might have outrun us to the border with Earth Country." "I see," Kurenai said thoughtfully. "I agree with your reasoning, Hinata. Your decisive action not only saved 2 lives, but it also prevented a diplomatic incident, if not a war." Hanabi let out a snort. Konohamaru shushed her, glancing worriedly back at Naruto. Naruto didn't say anything, but he could feel his upper lip curling. Hinata really had saved their butts, so why was her sister being such a brat about it? The sun was setting and Naruto was very happy when they reached the camp so he could sit down for a moment even if Hanabi didn't seem to think much of it. Konohamaru, on the other hand, thought it was really neat. Naruto knew he was training to become a ninja of the leaf. Maybe this was a preview of what he might be doing in a few years when he'd have missions of his own. On the other hand, there was no telling what Hanabi's problem was. After a moment, he rose to his feet and made his way to the nearby stream. The blood came off his hand fairly easily, as did the bloody mud that stuck to his pants. But the blood in his jacket had soaked in, and he really had to scrub to get it out. The heavy fabric was waterlogged before he was done. He grimaced and carried the folded jacket back to the tents, planning to dry it by the fire. The evening air was cool on his skin, and the breeze ruffled his black t-shirt as he walked toward the fire. Konohamaru looked up and peered at him curiously. "What's that, Naruto-san?" he asked, pointing at Naruto's wrist. Naruto peered down at the rounded bracer of leather and metal. "Ah, that's my wrist weight. It helps me increase my speed and strength." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Hinata look up suddenly, her expression chagrined. Kurenai wordlessly reached into her bag and handed Hinata her weights. Hinata accepted them with a blush. Hanabi peered at him curiously. "What's the point of slowing yourself down with those?" She hadn't noticed Hinata, for which Naruto was quietly grateful, so he answered her question, ignoring the tone. "If I wear these all the time, my muscles get used to moving with the extra burden, then when I really need it, I get rid of the weights and I move that much faster. Wearing these when you train is also good for building up your endurance." "You spar with weights on?" Konohamaru asked, eyes wide. "Yeah," Naruto said. "I learned about them sparring with an older shinobi named Rock Lee." Hanabi let out a laugh. I know him. He's that loud crazy baka that Nijian Ai-san is saddled with on his team. I wouldn't do anything he told me to do. It was Gai-sensei's idea, Naruto said coldly, who is Lee's sensei and must therefore be Niji's Jonin sensei as well. Why don't you ask your Nijian Ai-san if his sensei is a fool? That man knows more about taijutsu than almost anyone I can think of. Naruto! A loud voice cried out, making him cringe reflexively. It warms my heart to hear you defend my teachings. You have truly not forgotten the fire of youth. Guy! Naruto gasped. Yash, sensei. Lee, Naruto said, rubbing his eyes. Guy and Lee leapt into the clearing, obviously practicing their dynamic entry. They were followed less dramatically by several ANBU in their distinctive animal masks, a large, rough-looking woman with red marks on her face and shaggy hair, a huge black dog, a man with long hair and white eyes, and a tall man with sunglasses and a large concealing full-length coat that had to be related to Shino. Tenten and a boy with the distinctive Hyuga eyes rounded out the crowd. Hanabi immediately ran toward the white-eyed man in long, flowing white robes. She quickly bowed before him, and he nodded his acknowledgement. Hinata shakily rose from her seat and presented herself similarly, but her bow did not receive any acknowledgement. The tall woman grunted and scratched the black dog's ears. I told you the kids had been released, she grumbled. Their scent trails held no hints of duress, and Kuramaru can always tell the difference. I am surprised that those three were bested by a team of mere genin, the white-eyed man said. It would be more likely that they had their prize stolen by Iwa-nin taking advantage of the Hokage's laxness. Naruto scowled at that. Their counterparts across the border only tried something once well, that they knew of. Still, they didn't seem eager to test them after that first confrontation. However unlikely it may seem, Hayashi-sama, the man wearing sunglasses replied in an urbane tone, it would appear that those three missing nins were, in fact, defeated by a genin team. The man turned toward Shino. To what extent were you injured? I sustained first-degree burns to my right forearm, with some second-degree tissue damage in one spot on the top of my wrist, along with mild smoke inhalation, Shino replied in a curiously detached voice. But then he frowned enough for his eyebrows to become visible. Unfortunately, I was surprised by a seal-less fire and sustained significant losses to my colony. I estimate my Kikaijutsu capacity has decreased by 60%. The older man nodded slowly. It was fortunate that you had not committed more of your reserves. However, when you accompany us back to Konoha, you can bind more to your queen to restore your colony. But Shino shook his head. Unfortunately, our relief is not due for another 3 days. The large woman let out a loud bark of laughter. I think the ANBU can cover for you for a couple of days. Your team looks like it went through a meat grinder, you most of all. Ayano, Hinata said hesitantly, drawing annoyed glares from the two Hyuga men that made her falter for a moment. The Hokage ordered us to stay here until we received a specific written message, she continued quickly, ducking her head. Naruto blinked. He was honestly surprised that she'd managed to get that out, not to mention a little proud of his shy teammate. Hinata's right, he said loudly, drawing the attention of the angry Hyugas. Not that he cared, they were probably idiots like Hanabi, anyway. Gai-sensei frowned. Kurenai? He asked. My genin has accurately summarized our orders, she said, and the pride in her voice was unmistakable. We would be failing to complete our assigned mission if we left the border now unless you have specific orders from the Hokage? Are you openly defying my authority? The elder Hyuga asked in a dangerous tone. Kurenai lifted her chin. Not at all, she said coolly. But our orders came from the Hokage, and only he may countermand them. You, Hayashi-sama, are not part of that chain of command. No one wishes to usurp your mission, Kurenai-san, Shino's father said quickly, cutting off Hayashi and earning a glare of his own. We merely thought your team was not in a condition to complete it. Your concern is appreciated, Kurenai replied politely, but Hinata and Naruto are basically uninjured, and Shino's mobility is unimpaired. Additionally, the rock ninja appear to be less than eager to test our defenses. Were they scared off when we all arrived, sensei? Lee asked Guy. No, Shino answered, shaking his head, they think Naruto is the fourth Hokage and are therefore terrified of him. Naruto wanted to sink into the earth, without using a doton, as the adults all turned toward him in shock. One of the ANBU snorted behind his mask. Naruto supposed Shino was getting payback for all the times he knocked him around during their latest sparring sessions. Hey! They were standing a long distance away, he grumbled. A very long distance, the wild-haired woman agreed, laughing coarsely, if they thought you were the yondaime. Naruto scowled and stuck his lip out. The patient, watchful corner of his mind that Kurenai-sensei had been encouraging him to develop noted the way his antics had dispersed the tension in the air. Most of the adults were smiling slightly, except Hayashi Team, who was glaring at him, and the other genins looked bored. At least no one was glaring holes in Hinata, or acting like they were going to try to force them to abandon their mission. However, the older version of Shino continued after a moment, my son will still be operating with a significant handicap with his depleted Kikai swarm. My sentries are still in place, Shino replied calmly. While I may not have as much directing capacity, Naruto and Hinata's capabilities have grown well beyond my projections. They will more than offset the deficit. Naruto was a little embarrassed that Hinata puzzled out their teammates' words before he did, and was the first to turn towards Shino in mild shock. Was he actually praising their strength, in his own weird way? He found himself anticipating bragging about such an unexpected development the next time he saw Irika-sensei. Then his stomach tried to turn itself inside out, and it was all he could do to control his facial expression. I am gratified that your first-hand observations have proven to be superior in terms of accuracy, Shino's father replied. However, there may be another option. I will leave one of my smaller colonies with you, and replace it when I return. A second colony? Shino said, stammering for the first time Naruto could remember. Yes, the man replied. You are due to begin hosting a second group, as you are well beyond my own projections regarding your development. I commend your sensei for her suggested training regimen. He paused to nod slightly toward Kurenai, who returned the acknowledgement, blushing slightly. We have already discussed the theory behind managing multiple queens, he continued. Just make sure their reproductive cycles do not conflict, and you should do well. Thank you, Shino said as his father put a hand on his shoulder. Naruto tried not to make a face as a large number of bugs crawled out of the man's sleeve and flowed over Shino's collar. Just watching it made him itch between his shoulder blades. He knew Shino probably had him bug-tagged as a precaution, he just preferred not to think about it. Naruto decided to casually look away before the compulsion to scratch became too strong. Gai-sensei caught his eye and nodded gravely. I hope you are keeping up with your training, he said. Lee has already increased his weights again. Naruto grimaced. Crap, I've sparred as much as I am able, but we've been working more on jutsus and chakra control. Guy planted his fists on his hips and struck what he probably thought was an encouraging pose. That's all right, Naruto. You can practice those while you are away. Lee and I will get you back in shape when you return. I'll also want to hear about your battle. Those missing Nins were serious opponents, and I'll want to hear about your contributions to your team's victory. Naruto made a face, but nodded and quickly changed the subject. There was a question that was eating at him anyway. Do you think the funeral will be held before we return? Guy frowned in confusion. We won't hold a funeral for those criminals, Naruto. The ANBU will retrieve their bodies for study, but they deserve no better than that for what they did. Naruto shook his head. No, I mean for Irika-sensei, he said in little more than a whisper. His throat was trying to close for some reason. Just saying it made it all too real. Guy let out a laugh, which sparked a momentary rage in Naruto. Irika was badly injured, but he was found in time and brought to the hospital. Before the ANBU located the kidnapper's trail, I was told that he is expected to make a full recovery. Naruto's eyes widened. Yada! He screamed as he leapt into the air, pumping his fists. All the others were staring at him, some of them with obvious distaste, but he couldn't care less. Guy, after a quick consultation with Kurenai, led his team on a quick circuit of the border zone for practice as Shino's father, Abirame Shibi, finalized the colony transfer to his son. Hayashi stood at the edge of the camp, his arms folded in obvious impatience, as the rough-looking woman, who'd been introduced as Inuzuka-tsum, Kiba's mother, stood next to him, telling jokes to the silent ANBU. Of course, she might have received more reaction if they had been good jokes. Konoha Maru joined Naruto in a relieved mixture of crying and laughter when he realized that he'd been wrong about Irika. Hanabi looked like she was about to say something when Hinata suggested that she should report to their father. The younger girl looked sharply at her sister, her eyes widening slightly in surprise, but she didn't say anything before she stalked off. I'm glad Iruka-sensei will recover, Hinata said in a quiet voice. Yeah, Naruto said. I'm sorry I kind of went nuts when Guy told me. He scratched at the back of his head as his face colored a little. Recalling the contempt of the Hyuga's faces made him scowl. Is it a bad thing to care about people, Naruto? Hinata asked. It's not something you should be ashamed of, is it? Naruto frowned. Was she asking him or telling him? He wondered if she thought about that a lot. I don't know, Hinata. We were told in the academy that shinobi are supposed to be emotionless, but Kurenai doesn't seem to feel that way. He recalled how she encouraged him to think of his teammates as friends to be protected. Even if that was his role on Team 8, she didn't seem to just think about it in that way. That's good, too, he concluded after a moment, because I don't want to be a ninja like that, do you? Hinata smiled shyly, shaking her head as her eyes veered downward. You were worried about your sister, weren't you? He asked after a moment's thought. Konohamaru still sat off to the side, listening quietly. Hinata hesitated before nodding. When you grabbed her from that missing nin, you should have seen how you moved, Hinata. You were incredible. I was? She asked. I don't remember, I just remember being scared she would be hurt. Naruto shook his head. You grabbed her and ran up that tree so fast I could barely see you. In a flash, you had her behind Kurenai and were cutting her free. Do you think you would have done as well if you didn't care? Hinata shook her head slowly. Good, Naruto said, and if caring about people is not the regular way for shinobi, well, we'll just make our own way of the ninja, right? Hinata looked up, meeting his eyes for once. Right, she said, her normally velvet soft voice carrying a hint of steel. Naruto couldn't help but smile at her fierceness, and she immediately looked away and excused herself, saying she needed to see about dinner. He frowned at her back as she walked toward the fire. What had he said wrong now? He looked down at Konohamaru, whose face was scrunched up in a frown. I like that nindu, Naruto-san. I'm going to tell Aji-san that I want to follow that nindu as well. Naruto made a chagrined face as Konohamaru stood up and walked over to get a better look at Sum's enormous nin dog, Kuramaru. He didn't want to think about all the trouble he would be in if people thought he'd corrupted the Hokage's grandson into following some heretical nindu. Of course, the aggravation it would give that stuck-up Arobaka, Ebisu, might be worth it. The blonde genin sighed as he stretched before leaving to gather more wood to build up the fire. Hinata was preparing most of their stored meat and dipping heavily into the rice bag, using the largest collapsible pot to boil it. He supposed she was right to do so, if she planned to feed this many people. Kurenai gave Naruto a pointed look as he returned with an armload of dead wood. She cut her eyes toward a very industrious Hinata and smiled slightly. Naruto nodded and left to get more wood. A lot more. The campsite smelled rather appetizing when Team Guy returned. Your system of semi-random paths is very devious, Guy announced in a grand voice. It would be quite difficult for an intruder to anticipate your position at any particular time, especially if young Shino has made good use of his little friends. Ha ha ha. Naruto did his best to show respect and not wince at Guy's humor. Shino and his father nodded at each other and stood up. Naruto's ears could almost make out what sounded like a faint buzzing sound coming from them, but he couldn't be sure. Hinata was setting out their entire store of eating utensils, and Sum was eagerly walking toward the fire when Hayashi's voice interrupted them. If the aburames are done, we should leave now, he said. Hey, she just fixed dinner for us. Sum objected. It will soon be dark, Hayashi said in a patronizing tone. We are very near a semi-hostile border. You may risk the Hokage's grandson if you wish, but I do not want my heir to linger here any longer than necessary. Now that Aburame is finished with his son, I insist that she be brought back to Konoha. With a full escort. Immediately. Hayashi-sama is within his rights to make such a demand, Shino's father said in a very bland tone. Naruto glanced at Shino out of the corner of his eye. He had some suspicions about when Shino talked like that, and they were now being confirmed. We will return now. Kurenai-san, we will report to the Hokage as soon as possible. Understand that I will advise him to recall your team immediately for a thorough debriefing. Try to record any words the kidnappers may have said or any clues as to the identity of their employers. The direction of their flight may not be a completely reliable indicator of their objectives. Kurenai nodded as the visitors all stood up. Naruto noticed Hinata hurriedly place some of the rice balls and seasoned deer skewers into a folded cloth and quickly handed it to Tenten. The weary Kunoichi smiled and bowed to the girl, as did Lee, whose stomach let out a low growl. Naruto guessed they would be traveling fast, because the Hyuga boy, Neji, picked up Hanabi and Guy lifted a protesting Konohamaru into his arms. They leapt into the trees, surrounded by most of the ANBU squad. Shibi, Hayashi, and the rest of Team Guy followed. Some scowled after them, but smiled when Hinata handed her another bundle of food. The playfully mussed the girl's hair as she thanked her, then she followed the others into the trees, Kuramaru loping into the woods below her. Still, when she turned back around, the blushing Hinata looked at all the remaining food she'd worked so hard to prepare and her face fell. Well, Naruto said, racking his brains for something to say to her. More for us. I'm really starving, and Shino is eating for 3 now. In all honesty, the fight had taken a lot out of him, so he joined his team at the cook fire and proceeded to stuff his face. Shino and Kurenai also seemed unusually hungry as well. In the end, his stomach hurt a little, but there weren't any leftovers from the large meal. Hinata's eyes had gone a little wide as Naruto continued to eat the simple, but well-prepared food. When he was finally done, Naruto leaned back and patted his slightly distended stomach. He could barely move, and they'd have to hunt tomorrow, but Hinata was smiling, a little ruefully, at her teammates. That night, as Naruto struggled to find a comfortable position to sleep in, he wondered about this new nindu he and Hinata were going to follow. He'd need to think about this. A lot. Chapter 8. Naruto did not sleep well that night. Of course, that was like saying that Uchiha Sasuke was a little stuck up, or that Sakura was slightly enamored of him. In other words, a massive understatement. He tossed and turned until dawn, sleeping fitfully for only a few minutes at a time. Each time he managed to drop off, he'd have such disturbing dreams that he'd thrash himself awake in short order, barely avoiding hitting Shino as he slept next to him. He pondered the new ninja's way he and Hinata were going to follow as he first dozed off, but then he abruptly found himself reliving that fight again. He was strangling the fire ninja. What was his name? Kuro. He could still feel the man's throat under his fingers, but it was the terror that shone in his eyes that Naruto couldn't forget. The man had been afraid of him, and worse, he'd enjoyed that fear. He'd lapped it up like his landlord's cat with a saucer of milk. He'd been disappointed when the fire grew too close to Hinata and he had to break the man's neck to stop his fire. Naruto knew that a shinobi would sometimes be required to kill an enemy in order to complete his assignment. They even talked about it at the academy, and an old man from the hospital came and talked to each student privately after that lecture. Naruto grimaced. When he met with the man, Aji-san said before dismissing him that he doubted Naruto would have any problems. At the time, he thought he'd been praised and left with a smile on his face. Now, Naruto knew the man was making an oblique reference to Kyuubi. After all, demons enjoyed killing, didn't they? So in the depths of the night, Naruto stared up at the darkness inside the tent he shared with Shino, and wondered if the villagers had been right all along. Only a monster would savor someone's fear like that. He already had the demon's red chakra running through his body. Was it corrupting his mind as well? For a moment, he cursed Kurenai for teaching him to think things through, because now he could only lay there as his mind and emotions churned. It was said that power corrupts. How much more would that be true for power that flowed from a corrupted source? Inside him was the demon that wrecked Konoha and stole the life of its greatest leader. If it was corrupting him, shouldn't he try to do the honorable thing while he was still capable of feeling loyalty to Konoha? At one point, he began to think about reaching for a kunai, but then he remembered the mission they were on. Shino was still injured, and most of their group tactics depended on Naruto, as backup if nothing else. Also, if the Iwanins were afraid of him, they wouldn't press Team 8 for the last few days of their patrol. They needed him alive, at least until they made it back to Konoha. Then he could figure out what he needed to do. If something happened to him after they returned, the Hokage wouldn't send them on another dangerous mission until a replacement had been assigned. Maybe someone who wasn't stupid. Naruto slipped the metal ring off of his finger a couple of minutes before his alarm was due to shock him awake. He wearily climbed out of the small tent, gritty eyes blinking at the gray light of dawn. He shrugged into his jacket, trying to ignore the small flecks of dark brown amidst the green of his sleeve. He'd need to take a trip to the laundromat when they returned, Or would he? Naruto shook his head. He'd been up all night thinking, but he still didn't know what to do. He gathered more wood for the fire, moving as silently as a wraith through the early morning stillness. When he returned to the camp, Kurenai-sensei was awake, sitting near the fire with a folded map in her lap. Her red eyes were expressionless as she studied him. "How did you sleep?" she asked, the concern in her voice evident, even to him. Naruto shrugged, not trusting his voice. Hinata was a little sore when she awoke. For all that, she'd slept soundly. It was hard to believe that yesterday hadn't just been some elaborate fever dream. She still couldn't recall what she'd been doing or thinking when she rescued Hanabi, but Naruto-kun said she'd been incredible. The way he'd smiled when he said that made her stomach ache a little, mainly because she knew she was making more out of it than was really there. Still, he wanted her to join him in his nindu. That had to count for something, didn't it? Maybe one day, when he became Hokage, she'd be able to teach others his ninja way. It was doubtful that she'd ever qualify for Yanbu, but maybe she could become one of the chunins that guarded his office. That way she'd be able to see him almost every day. Surely he'd still have a smile for his old teammate, even after he became Hokage? She smiled at this pleasant fantasy as she sat up and stretched. She had a few bruises and some stiffness, but she should be more than able to perform her duties within the team. She carefully pulled on her sandals and slipped out of the tent. Kurenai-sensei was already awake, but Shino-kun was just emerging from the other tent. She offered to look at his arm, but he merely shook his head. "The pain is manageable, and it retains the necessary mobility. I am fine for now." Hinata nodded, and then began pouring out some rice for a quick breakfast before their next patrol. She frowned as she set the pot on the embers. "I know, Kurenai-sensei," she said in a quiet voice. "Is Naruto still asleep?" "No, Hinata, he's been up for a while now," Kurenai said, frowning slightly. "I heard him several times in the night, so I don't think he slept very much at all." "Is it because he ate too much?" Hinata asked, feeling slightly guilty. She had a feeling he'd eaten more than he really wanted so she wouldn't feel awkward about dinner. It wasn't fair if he suffered because her father was displeased with her performance in the battle. She was growing weary of her constant failures, especially when others paid the price. "No," Kurenai said, shaking her head. Then she sighed. "He is troubled by yesterday's battle." "Why is that?" Shino asked, startling Hinata a little. He was so quiet at times that one almost forgot he was there. "He performed the best out of the three of us," he continued. Kurenai took a deep breath. Something Hinata had learned usually meant she was about to discuss something she didn't really wish to. "Naruto was forced to take a life yesterday, and I believe it was his first time." "Naruto killed one of the kidnappers?" Hinata gasped. "Actually, he dispatched Kuro and Kanzuya both," Kurenai gently corrected her. The camp was cloaked in utter silence for a long moment. "That is impressive," Shino finally said. "Yes," Kurenai agreed, "but I think he still needs to come to terms with that. We should leave him alone while he works this out. You remember when this issue was discussed at the academy?" Both genin nodded. "Good," Kurenai continued, "then you know it will likely take a little while for Naruto to work through this. But he knows that he did what was necessary to preserve lives and ensure the successful completion of our mission. I don't think he will forget that, but if he is quiet for a while, we shouldn't make a big deal out of it, all right?" Hinata nodded along with Shino, though her stomach churned at the thought of Naruto in turmoil. Sensei was right, they just needed to leave him alone until he could work things out and recover his focus. The old man had told her that the first time was usually the hardest by far. It wasn't good to become callous toward killing, like many did, but one grew better at regaining focus afterward. Naruto worked so hard at everything he did that she had little doubt he would bounce back from this and be his normal self in no time. Unfortunately, Naruto did not return to his normally cheerful self that day. He was unusually taciturn as they ran their patrol route, responding to his teammates with little more than a grunt. Under other circumstances, Hinata might have been crushed, thinking she had angered him in some way, but he was so obviously distraught that, for once, such thoughts didn't even occur to her. After they returned to camp, Kurenai mentioned that they should probably hunt so they will have some meat for dinner. Naruto curtly said that he would see to it. He left their camp so quickly that Hinata wondered if he really just wanted an excuse to be alone. Naruto returned half an hour later, carrying an entire deer across his shoulders. He dumped it next to the fire without a word and stalked off. Hinata stared at the bloody offering. Kurenai gripped the kunai that was embedded in the animal's skull, but she could only pull it out with obvious effort. The scrape of steel on bone was very loud in the otherwise silent camp. Hinata was annoyed to discover that she was pressing her index fingers together again. "I will help you dress the meat, sensei," Shino said quietly, but Hinata looked up to realize that he was facing her, rather than Kurenai. As the two of them dragged the deer away from the camp to attend to this task, Hinata looked down at the gathered herd she'd been organizing for dinner. Hyuga Hinata knew that she had many faults. She lacked confidence, and the forcefulness her father said was essential for a strong leader. She was an inferior shinobi that inevitably dragged down the performance of her team, and she was indeed fortunate that they did not despise her for it. But she was not incapable of taking a hint. She followed the path Naruto had taken from the camp. While she had been trained to follow people by noticing traces of disturbed vegetation or trampled grass, this was hardly necessary. All she had to do was follow the splashing sounds. She found Naruto squatted by the small stream, scrubbing vigorously at his hands, which were already reddened from the rough treatment. He was muttering something under his breath that she couldn't quite make out, something about over and done with. For an unhappy moment she wondered if he resented her and Shino for not doing more during the battle. Perhaps if they had, he wouldn't have been forced to kill. Her steps faltered and she almost turned around. But then she remembered that Naruto was seldom quiet when he didn't think something was fair. When they trained together, he wasn't cruel, but he also didn't mince words the few times he didn't think she was doing her best. He said he'd learned that from Gai-sensei, but after seeing the Jonin's dynamic entry technique, she wondered what else Naruto had learned. At least her confidence in Naruto kept her moving forward toward the stream bank. As she approached, the blonde genin's head swung around so fast that Hinata flinched back in spite of herself. Naruto's scowl vanished in an instant as he looked chagrined. "Sorry," he muttered. Hinata tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. "Ayano, Naruto, you don't seem yourself today," she finally said. Hinata didn't understand how what she said could have struck a nerve, but Naruto's face immediately shut down. "Maybe because I'm not," he snapped. Hinata was glad that her feet seemed frozen in place at his obvious signs of temper. That made it easier for her to stand her ground. At the academy, the doctor who came in, he told me that the first time is usually the hardest," she said, looking downward. "Really?" Naruto asked in a darkly sarcastic tone she'd never heard him use before. "Well, he told me he didn't think I'd have any problems at all, like I'm some monster that would probably enjoy killing," he added bitterly. Hinata felt her stomach contract into a ball of ice, as much for his tone as for the words themselves. Why had the old man told Naruto such a cruel thing? The rage she'd felt burning in her heart when she faced the spy was back, blazing even hotter than before. "Did he really say that?" she asked in a quiet voice, her hands shaking as she clenched her fists at her sides. Naruto nodded wearily, his expression puzzled. "That's bullshit," she yelled at Naruto, using a word she'd picked up from him in their training sessions. Naruto flinched back like he'd been kicked, lost his balance, and fell into the stream. Hinata's hands flashed to her traitorous mouth as her eyes widened in horror. How could she have done such a thing? Splashing and sputtering, Naruto struggled to his feet, water streaming out of his uniform. Hinata felt her heart breaking as she realized what she'd done. He'd never forgive her for this. He might even ask to be transferred to another team. He'd definitely never train with her again. Hinata began trying to formulate an apology of sufficient magnitude to salvage her friendship with her teammate as he wiped at his face, spat out some muddy water, and snorted. And then he laughed. It was more of a rusty chuckle at first, but it grew smoother and louder until he was halfway bent over, holding his knees for balance, and whooping like a madman at the tops of his lungs. Hinata was still frozen in place as Naruto sloshed back up onto the bank. He took off his jacket and began trying to wring it out. "And I just got this thing dry too," he muttered. That statement seemed to snap Hinata's shocked awareness back into her body again. "I'm sorry, Naruto, I didn't," she tried to apologize. He waved off her apologies. "It was my own fault," he said. Then he cleared his throat and did a rough imitation of Irika-sensei's voice. "But I am just shocked, I tell you, in such coarse language." Hinata felt her face reddening. I didn't mean to, I was just. Her voice trailed off and she took a steadying breath. She raised her chin and looked Naruto squarely in the face. He had no business saying something like that to you, Naruto-kun. That is what I meant to say. Naruto looked up from plucking the soaked t-shirt away from his chest. Maybe you were more accurate the first time, he said with a sigh. Then he peeled off the sopping wet fabric. Hinata abruptly turned and looked away. She listened to more water droplets hit the grass behind her as he slowly wrung out his shirt. He wasn't doing anything provocative, but she was still intensely uncomfortable. This made her feel faintly ridiculous, as they'd been camping along the border for weeks now. Trying to distract herself, she thought about his ominous words as she arrived. What did you mean about not being yourself? She asked him without thinking. Naruto did not answer at first. Worried about having given offense again, Hinata turned back around. Naruto was lost in thought, the t-shirt dangling from his fingers. He looked up at her after a moment, and then pulled it back on. When he met her eyes again, Hinata was stunned to see something she hadn't expected to see. Fear. Her teammate, who killed 2 missing Nins to protect them the day before, was showing more fear than she'd ever seen in him before. Was it possible that the old man had been right, and that Naruto was somehow destined to become some kind of mentally unbalanced killer? Something about that just didn't ring true, though this had to be bigger, much bigger, to scare the future Hokage of Konoha. Somehow, thinking about things bigger than Hokage's let something begin to fall into place in her mind. Does this have something to do with the red chakra? She suddenly asked. Naruto slumped to the ground like his legs could no longer bear his weight. He sprawled next to his damp jacket. Yes, he whispered. Hinata felt uncomfortably like an inquisitor, standing over him like that, so she gracefully knelt on the grass next to him. I noticed the seal on your stomach the first time you used your chakra pulse technique, she said slowly. At first I thought it was some training method you used to build up your chakra. But I consulted all the scrolls I could find on seals, and the only things I could find that used seals that complex were prisons, Naruto said quietly, cutting her off. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression indecipherable. Hinata was almost afraid to breathe, wary of breaking this fey mood he'd fallen into. This was important. She knew it the same way she knew Naruto would find a way to become Hokage someday. But why was she almost shivering with fear? They never celebrate my birthday, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. Why? She asked in little more than a whisper, even as her heart wrenched with pity, and that cold voice in the back of her mind told her that she didn't really want to know the answer to that question. Better to let things go on as they were. Naruto sighed. I was born on October 10th, 12 years ago, he said. Hinata had always been the fact-checker for their group planning sessions, but everyone in Konoha knew what day that was. That's the day the Kyuubi. Her voice trailed off as her eyes went wide. Naruto looked down, but not before Hinata saw the light go right out of those bright blue orbs. The 4th Hokage couldn't kill it. No one could. So he sealed it into a newborn infant. You, Hinata whispered. It was an effort to even move her lips, as the enormity of what she just had confirmed crashed down on her. Yes, he said in a dead voice. The 3rd Hokage made a law forbidding anyone from revealing that secret except me, so you can't say anything. But our mission will be over in a few days. After that, you guys can get a new combat specialist. Why? She choked out. Was he angry that she'd figured out his secret? Or had she pressed him too hard for answers? She clenched her jaw to keep from crying out in dismay. Naruto shook his head like she was an annoying fly. Why? He asked in a puzzled voice. Hinata, there's a demon inside of me. It almost got out when I was fighting those guys. I could have killed all of you. Did you try to let it out? Hinata asked, trying to suppress her revulsion at what had been done to him. To be honest, there was some fear as well. Her clan had suffered heavy losses when the Kyuubi attacked, losses they had yet to recover. No, Naruto said quickly. But when I got the drop on Kuro, he swallowed thickly, strangling him, and he was terrified of me and all this red chakra that was pouring out of me. And I was enjoying his fear. He was blasting out all this fire, but it couldn't stop me. I kept squeezing until I saw the fire was about to reach you, then I broke his neck to stop it. His voice trailed off and he raised his haunted eyes to hers. Hyuga Hinata had watched Uzumaki Naruto for years before they were placed on the same team. She thought she'd seen all his moods, happy, angry, frustrated, mischievous, but nothing like this. He looked sad and old, in a way. He seemed so lost and alone that she realized that much of what she'd admired before this day had been merely a mask. In a sense, she felt betrayed that her idol of confidence and determination had been revealed to have feet of clay. At the same time, her heart ached as she wondered how many people, if any, had ever seen this side of him. "Naruto," she said gently, "I don't think a demon would care if I were burned or not." "But that just means that our personalities may be mixing," Naruto insisted. "I care about what happens to you now, but what about your next mission? Will I stop caring then and let you die?" Hinata just shook her head violently, making her bangs rearrange themselves. "Not you," she insisted, "never." "You don't understand," Naruto insisted. "I was scaring him, and I was enjoying it like some sick freak." "I know," Hinata murmured as she tried to get her emotions back under control. What she'd learned was huge, but she'd have to digest that later. Naruto needed her to be calm and rational right now. "Kuro is the one who burned you." Naruto nodded, but didn't say any more. "Did he do other things to anger you, besides hurt you and Shino?" Hinata asked shrewdly. Naruto's face reddened, but he just nodded and did not otherwise answer. "Naruto, the old man told me that such feelings are normal in a violent confrontation," Hinata continued in a voice that was almost serene compared to earlier. Naruto blinked. "Really?" Hinata nodded. "So you don't think," Naruto began, but let his voice trail off as Hinata shook her head. Are you okay with this, Hinata?" She looked up at the almost pleading tone in his voice. Whether it was that or the haunted look in his eyes, something gave her the courage to lean forward and put her hand on his forearm. The skin was cool and damp from his recent dunking, but it warmed rapidly under her fingertips. "I would rather have you stay with Team 8, and Naruto-kun," she managed to choke out before her throat completely closed off. Naruto gazed at her with something akin to wonder in his eyes, and it thrilled her to the core that she had made that dead look go away. She had made Naruto happy again, with just a few words. She was more proud of that than any of the pitiful few triumphs of her life thus far. "Thank you, Hinata-chan," Naruto said, smiling as she reddened even further. His stomach made a hollow grinding sound, so long and so prolonged that it utterly shattered the mood. Naruto ducked his head sheepishly as Hinata quickly withdrew her hand from his arm. Her hand covered her mouth, concealing a shy smile. "I should be getting dinner started," she said as she gracefully rose to her feet. Naruto grabbed his jacket as he rolled to his feet. He carried the damp fabric as he followed Hinata back to the camp. "We have sufficient meat to last for the remaining duration of our assignment," Shino reported as Hinata rejoined them around the smokeless fire. He was carefully unwinding the bandages on his forearm. Hinata nodded and began preparing skewers as Naruto ducked into the boy's tent. "Sensei," she said quietly, and Kurenai looked up from the kunai she was sharpening. "Yes, Hinata?" Kurenai asked. "I think you should talk to Naruto," she answered calmly, though she was still seething inside. The counselor who spoke to him at the academy gave him extremely poor advice. "Why would he do that?" Kurenai asked, peering intently at her. "Ayano," Hinata said, her eyes flickering over at Shino for an instant. "I am not permitted to say," she replied. "Does this have to do with the Kyuubi?" Shino asked in a perfectly normal tone of voice. Hinata froze in place. Naruto's head shot out of the tent at the word Kyuubi. He frowned at Hinata, who began stammering denials of having broken the law as he crawled out of the tent in a pair of shorts and a dry t-shirt. "I am not stupid, Naruto," Shino said evenly, turning toward the boy and beginning to tick off points on his fingers. "You have a chakra capacity exceeding that of most, even though you have just become a genin. You can master highly chakra-intensive techniques with far more ease than you can master less demanding ones, suggesting that your chakra capacity is literally filled to overflowing most of the time. Even the most forthcoming adults of Konoha are strangely unwilling to discuss the reasons why you are shunned by most. There are no physical relics from the nine-tailed fox, even though our history texts state that it was slain by the fourth Hokage. Your physical stamina is superhuman, and you recover from minor injuries at a rate unprecedented for someone not under a physician's care. Your birth date is a matter of public record, as are the unusual birthmarks on your face. And finally, when we spar, I can have half my colony feed off of your chakra until they are replete, and you do not even notice." He closed his hands and seemed to look Naruto squarely in the eyes. I am neither stupid nor unobservant. Hinata's mouth was hanging open, though she was relieved that Naruto knew she hadn't revealed his secret. Their sensei looked both proud and amused. The last member of their team was either. You stuck your bugs on me when we sparred? Naruto demanded, outraged. That's cheating. I was curious as to whether your increased speed was from chakra or purely physical conditioning, Shino replied. Naruto made a face. I am going to smash them if you do that again, he threatened. It would be useless to do so, Shino replied, since you seem to have inexhaustible chakra reserves. It is also not good for the Kikai to gorge on chakra. You get fat bugs? Naruto asked, and then gave a shudder. Never mind, I don't want to know. How long have you? I have suspected for a while. Our last sparring session at the inn was the last data I needed. I finalized my conclusions and eliminated the alternative hypotheses after we established our camp here. The only possible explanation for the observed facts was that the Kyuubi had been sealed to you or merged in a similar fashion. The bug user looked down and began smearing a clear ointment on his burned wrist. Naruto came out of the tent to sit down by the fire. In his black t-shirt and dark orange shorts he looked younger, in a way. His weights were still visible on his arms and legs, but Hinata almost didn't even notice them anymore. He rubbed his eyes and Hinata remembered Sensei saying he hadn't slept well the previous night. So Shino, do you have a problem with this? Is it being sealed inside me? He asked. The Hokage would not have placed you on a genin team if you were dangerous in any way, Shino responded. Our sensei is unusually solicitous of our physical safety, and she does not seem apprehensive regarding your presence. Your more unusual attributes, which I surmise are effects of the Kyuubi being sealed inside you, have proven to be an asset, both in training and during confrontations. Naruto nodded slowly at this, but Kurenai-sensei spoke up. You have spoken about the Hokage's motivations, as well as my own, Shino, she said. What are your personal observations? Shino glanced at their sensei with what Hinata might have considered annoyance, had it come from another. He paused briefly, and adjusted his glasses before speaking. Based upon my interactions, I find the reactions of the villagers to be illogical and poorly thought through. Naruto bears far less ill will than many others would in his position, something that would be impossible if he were being influenced or possessed by a demonic entity. Also, his solicitude towards certain of his superiors and colleagues is at odds with such a negative characterization of his personality. Naruto just blinked at their teammate. Then he turned toward Kurenai-sensei. He's saying that you're too nice a person for him to worry about that, the said with a sigh. Oh, Naruto said. He turned back toward Shino. Why didn't you just say so? He asked. Shino did not answer, and instead began rewrapping his bandages. Hinata moved to help him, but he waved her off, proving to be surprisingly dexterous with his left hand. Hinata went back to preparing the skewers while they all sat in silence. Naruto propped up his jacket and pants to dry near the fire, flashing a grin at her embarrassment, then began feeding small twigs into the flames. Kurenai took out a kunai and began slowly filing a nick out of the blade. Hinata? Kurenai asked after a few minutes. Yes, sensei? Hinata answered as she packed fragrant herbs around the sliced fragments of meat. Another pot of rice simmered over the coals. Why did you say I needed to talk to Naruto? They asked as she tested the edge of the kunai she'd been sharpening. Hinata swallowed. She gave Naruto an apologetic glance. Sensei, I do not believe Naruto received the proper instruction at the academy. On the subject we discussed this morning. Kurenai-sensei's eyes widened as she seemed to understand what Hinata was hinting at. Hinata didn't want to repeat Naruto's painful words if she could help it. The idea of anyone saying that to someone training to be a shinobi was awful, but saying it to someone like Naruto-kun was just unforgivable. Sensei seemed to share her opinion because her eyes narrowed and the air suddenly felt much colder. The three genins froze in place as the killer intent swept over them. It was fortunate that all of them knew they were not the target of this rage. Naruto, come with me, Kurenai snapped. Naruto jumped to his feet and followed their sensei out of the clearing without a word. Hinata swallowed and resumed preparing dinner, hoping that the familiar task would soothe her taut nerves. Naruto was thoughtful as he and Kurenai returned to their camp, following the appetizing smells of Hinata's handiwork. He was a little embarrassed that he hadn't really considered that the old man might have sought to sabotage him as much as the instructors who hated him. The old man was an expert on human psychology, which was why he conducted the counseling sessions, and he knew his own subject well enough to know how to conceal his distaste for Kyuubi's jailer. That's what made his false advice and assessment so effective. But it didn't make Naruto feel any less stupid. Kurenai's anger had been awe-inspiring, not to mention a little frightening. When they'd withdrawn far enough from the camp for a private discussion, she made him sit on a fallen log and tell her everything that was said during the counseling session. Before he was even halfway done, she was up and pacing as he talked. When he was finished, she turned away from him for a moment. Her hands moved too quickly to see, and a trio of kunai embedded in the trunk of the tree she was facing. That wasn't so unusual, but the fact that they penetrated halfway up the handles was. After retrieving her kunai and taking several deep breaths, Kurenai-sensei explained what he should have learned at the academy, before ever graduating, before even thinking about going on a mission. As a shinobi of the leaf, he would sometimes be placed into mortal conflicts, and inevitably would have to take a life. That was part of the job, and it didn't make him a monster to have done so. More important were the details. Was it possible for him to have avoided killing? Would avoidance have placed his teammates or his mission at risk? Or was he looking for excuses to kill? Was he antagonizing potential enemies in order to have an excuse to fight and kill them? In that context, yesterday's battle appeared quite different. The enemy had struck the first blows, attacking Iruka and kidnapping Konoha Maru and the bratty Hanabi. There was no question of letting them escape with their captives, even if Hinata hadn't already engaged them. With Hinata and Shino down, he and Kurenai were outnumbered. He just wished he hadn't been quite so gleeful with Kuro. Kurenai-sensei seemed to share Hinata's intuition. "What did he say?" she asked. When Naruto just stared at her, she continued, "I was concentrating on A, but I could hear that they were talking. I don't think you would have experienced such strong emotions in a combat situation without provocation. Guy and I both taught you better than that." Naruto was silent for a moment. "The big one told Kuro to cook me so they could gang up on you. Kuro said he'd rather take his time with Yu and H. Hinata," he whispered as his nails dug into his palms. His hands still shook. Kurenai quickly leaned forward, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. "Naruto!" "What?" Naruto asked, shaking his head to clear it of those memories. "Try to calm down," she said. "Your chakra was spiking very strongly, and I could see a faint red glow around you. As I said before, you seem to tap into its chakra when you are feeling strong negative emotions." "I'm sorry, sensei," Naruto mumbled as he looked down. "I was just..." "You were just acting in your role within the team," she finished for him. "A role I set for you and a role you fulfilled beyond my expectations yesterday." "But Shino and Hinata got hurt," Naruto protested. Kurenai frowned. "I do not expect you to intercept every blow aimed at your teammates, Naruto. That would be an unrealistic, not to mention unfair, expectation to place upon you. I apologize if that was the impression I had given. Do you think Shino and Hinata are weak?" "No, sensei," Naruto said quickly. He'd wanted to smack that brat Hanabi when she said that about Hinata. "Good. They are shinobi of the leaf, the same as you. Do not insult them," she replied. "They know the risks the same as you. While your abilities seem to be better suited for a direct confrontation, they are not helpless." But Naruto choked out as he struggled with his emotions. "They're my friends," he said in little more than a whisper. He looked up as he felt a hand on his shoulder. Kurenai was sitting on the log again, smiling at him. "Was that so hard to admit, Naruto? You care about your friends. That doesn't sound like the behavior of a demon, or a hardened killer, does it?" Naruto slowly shook his head. "I don't want anyone on Team 8 getting hurt," he said. Kurenai gave his shoulder a squeeze, startling him as she removed her hand. "I know how you feel," she said quietly. "I felt the same way about my team when I was a genin. Killing an enemy is never something to be taken lightly, but when it is done in defense of another life, no one will fault you, Naruto." "But I was enjoying," Naruto protested. "Their threats made you angry, didn't they?" his sensei asked. Naruto took a deep breath and nodded. He didn't even want to think about that again. "That person also taunted you as we fought," Kurenai added. "While you did not allow him to goad you into making a mistake, it is understandable that you might feel a sense of vindication when you were finally able to come to grips with him. Does that make sense to you? I suppose, Naruto said in a dubious voice. Kurenai sighed. Given that you seem to tap into the red chakra easier when you are feeling strong emotions, there is a possibility that your prisoner will attempt to influence you at such moments. However, your behavior during that skirmish was well within the bounds of acceptable behavior for an active duty shinobi. Stay on your guard the next time this happens, and I am sure you will continue to make me proud to have you as a student. Naruto felt like he'd been clubbed. Be proud? He stammered. Kurenai just stared at him incredulously. Naruto, you defended your team and defeated 2 enemies of higher rank. I am not sure I would have been able to defeat all 3 at once, so you quite possibly saved several lives yesterday. Do not let your concerns blind you to the fact that you performed your role well above my expectations. Naruto felt like an idiot, sitting there with his mouth hanging open. But he was completely numb. An hour ago, he'd been thinking about, well, never mind. Now, his sensei was telling him that what he'd done yesterday made her proud of him, and that he had done nothing he needed to worry about. It was almost too much for him to deal with. Kurenai sniffed the air. I think Hinata has dinner almost ready. We'd better get back or we'll hurt her feelings, right, Naruto? He nodded dumbly and stood up to follow his sensei back to the camp. His mind was still trying to catch up, but he knew it would. Eventually. Shino carefully flexed his right hand, feeling the dull ache as the skin pulled taut under the bandages. The medicinal cream Hinata loaned him was surprisingly effective at dulling the pain. When he asked her where she had purchased it, she shyly admitted that she'd made it herself. He wondered how she had become so adept at medicinal preparations, but he wasn't sure he really wanted to know. While Naruto wasn't the most perceptive of shinobi, he had been able to sense that something was not right with Hinata and the other Hyugas. It was hardly his place to pry into the workings of another Konoha family, let alone a clan with the influence and secretive nature of the Hyugas. However, once Naruto had raised his suspicions, it was almost impossible for him to not pick up on any clues that presented themselves. He wondered if his teammate had done that on purpose, but that seemed unlikely. Naruto was hardly manipulative. He lacked both the awareness and the inclination to make use of others in such a way. He was, for example, still ignorant of Hinata's feelings for him, which was an impressive feat in and of itself. He might have compared the Hyuga girl's affection for Naruto to the behavior of Uchiha Sasuke's fan club, but for several key differences. Hinata's behavior was far less forward than that of the kunoichis who pursued the last Uchiha of Konoha. She funneled her energies into improving her abilities by training with the object of her affections, a far more useful activity than pointless histrionics and bickering with rivals. Not that Hinata had too many rivals, of course. And that brought him to the last major difference. Given what he had seen of Uchiha Sasuke's behavior, he seemed less than interested in any of the kunoichis chasing him. As an object of romantic attention, he was far too self-absorbed and taciturn to make an ideal partner. Rather, they seemed to be chasing an impossibly idealized mirage they had built up in their minds and dubbed Uchiha Sasuke. They pursued the boy because they didn't really know anything about him. Hinata, on the other hand, seemed to understand Naruto better than anyone else, and it was only after being on the same team with them for months that Shino was starting to realize that. Aburame Shino had always prided himself regarding his observational skills. He liked to think that he saw things as they were, rather than letting emotions or prejudgments cloud his vision, so this was a particularly galling conclusion to reach. Nonetheless, correct behavior required that he admit his error. Hinata, he said quietly, watching her turn the fragrant skewers over the coals. Yes, Shino? She said, looking up. Do you recall our conversation at lunch the day we were assigned to Kurenai-sensei? Hinata didn't answer, but merely nodded, her eyes curious. Upon further consideration, I am forced to conclude that you were accurate in your initial assessment of Uzumaki Naruto, and I was incorrect, Shino said, trying to maintain his normal, precise diction. Hinata frowned at him, which was somewhat unexpected. Are you saying that because of what you had confirmed today? She replied, her voice somewhat sharp, which was even more surprising. Shino paused to gather his thoughts before formulating a response. Hinata's friendship with Naruto was having an even stronger effect on her personality than he expected. It would remain to be seen if this would be fortuitous or not. Not directly. However, I am beginning to realize the degree to which his learning environment was compromised by the rancor of the adults at the Konoha Ninja Academy. It was the subtle discouragement and negative feedback he received from the instructors that retarded his development, not a lack of focus or an unwillingness to apply himself. Observing his progress after he began working with joinins like Kurenai-sensei and Mado Guy has given me a much more accurate conception of his work ethic and overall capabilities. This has, in turn, drawn me to new conclusions. Hinata's pupilless eyes seemed to look right through him, even without the Byakugan active. Shino found himself somewhat uncomfortable under that gaze, which was another first. While he'd hoped Hinata would be able to coax Naruto out of his funk, he had no idea what passed between them while he and Kurenai dressed out the deer. Whatever transpired, it seemed to have had a significant effect on both of them. Naruto had revealed his secret to someone, probably for the first time, and it seemed to have galvanized the normally shy Kunoichi. "What are your conclusions?" Hinata asked, snapping Shino's mind back to the present. "I think you may be correct regarding his potential. With help, he may well become Hokage someday," Shino said. Hinata's eyes widened slightly, and then she nodded. "With our help," she added. Shino computed the probabilities of him recovering consciousness yesterday before one of the kidnappers killed him. Without Naruto's presence, they were marginal at best. "With our help," he agreed. "Thank you, Shino-kun," Hinata said, smiling. Shino straightened his glasses. "Konoha will prosper with a strong Hokage," he said. Naruto felt almost giddy with relief as he sat down next to the fire. Shino and Hinata looked up as he and Kurenai returned, but Hinata just smiled and returned to her cooking while Shino did whatever he did behind that collar of his. "I'm sorry I was acting like a jerk earlier," he said. Shino made a small noise that almost sounded like a snort. "Ayano, Naruto," Hinata said as she carefully laid the hot skewers on the plates, "we understand now." He smiled and scratched at the back of his head. It was a little uncomfortable, being around them after the conversations he'd had with Shino and Hinata. It was strange, he'd been dreading revealing his secret for so long, but once it was done, and nothing bad had happened, he still felt oddly exposed. He slowly began to relax as they ate. Hinata had outdone herself again. He didn't know how she managed to gather so many fresh greens to go with the rice and meat, but they added a nice touch. It wasn't ramen, but it was really good. Maybe she used her Byakugan while they were patrolling. As they ate, Kurenai discussed their plans for the remaining 3 days of their assignment. They would need to keep an eye out for their relief, but any shinobi without a properly sealed scroll should be treated as potentially hostile. It was not unknown for an infiltration team to take advantage of the changing of the border guards. When they finished, Naruto jumped up to collect the plates. When he bent over to get Hinata's, he gave her a big smile. "That was really good, Hinata-chan." While she blushed, for once Hinata didn't look away when he said something nice to her. "Thank you, Naruto," she replied in a small voice. He gave Kurenai-sensei a big grin when he grabbed her utensils, which she returned with a raised eyebrow. Shino's plate still had a little rice left on it. "Are you sure you ate enough for all those extra bugs?" Naruto asked him in a worried voice. "I don't want them chewing on me in the night if they get hungry." Shino made an exasperated sound. "My allies receive more than adequate nourishment, Naruto. Furthermore, they are incapable of attacking humans in the absence of specific instructions from their host. The Aburane family has spent years breeding their Kekai bugs for absolute obedience, and there have been no fratricidal incidents since they were introduced." Shino's voice trailed off as Naruto's laughter could no longer be contained. Shino silently handed him his plate as Naruto got himself back under control again. "Idiot," he said as Naruto turned to walk away. Naruto's laughter carried all the way back to the camp as he carried the dishes down to the stream. The following day's patrol was fairly routine. The rock ninjas seemed just as reluctant to test their vigilance again, a fact that never failed to bring a smile to Naruto's lips. He wondered how badly they would freak out once he became Hokage. Thinking about why they feared the fourth Hokage wiped the smile from his face. As he leapt from tree to tree, he remembered his shock at thinking the fourth Hokage had killed people. Kurenai said that things seemed to have gotten more serious after one of his students was killed. Now he had at least some idea of what they'd been talking about. If he'd been willing to kill to protect his team, how would it be for the Hokage, who was supposed to protect the entire village? Would he be ready to do what was necessary to protect everyone? Would he even be able to live with himself if was forced to wage war to protect his people? Since the ambush, Naruto had fallen into the habit of keeping an eye on Hinata as they traveled through the trees. It only made sense, given that she was usually the first to sense danger with her eyes. But watching the Hyuga girl leap from branch to branch also supplied him with his answer. He remembered how relieved he'd been when he realized that Shino and Hinata were all right. Yes, he could do what was necessary to keep his precious people safe. As they were looping back toward camp, Hinata stopped suddenly. Naruto's hands were already forming seals as her head snapped to the side. She held one hand behind her back, with 3 fingers extended. Shino dropped silently to the ground and Naruto knew his bugs were already in motion. Hinata and Kurenai changed directions and leapt into a tree to the left of their original course. Naruto followed them, accelerating so he was able to land next to them when they touched down to confront the trio of interlopers. They wore masks and hooded robes that just shouted ANBU to any resident of Konoha, but Naruto didn't relax at all. Kurenai said they needed to beware imposters, and she and Hinata would be right in the middle if a potential battle broke out. "Can we help you?" Kurenai asked coolly. Naruto noticed a couple of Kekai bugs pass by his feet, heading toward the intruders. "We're your relief," the middle ANBU said in a bored tone, his voice slightly muffled by the boar mask. "You're early," she observed. "Hokage's orders," the ANBU replied laconically. "Do you have proof?" Kurenai asked. The boar-masked ANBU slowly pulled out a scroll tube and tossed it to the. Naruto blurred into motion, snatching the scroll out of the air and pivoting so his body was between it and his team. "Hinata!" he barked. The ANBU dropped into defensive stances as Naruto braced himself for an explosion or attack. "It's all right," Hinata said quickly, her pale eyes glowing in the afternoon sunlight. "Just paper and ink. No chakra." Naruto relaxed slightly, and handed the scroll to Kurenai. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her closely examine the seal before breaking it and scanning the message. "Suspicious little bastard, aren't you?" the boar-masked ANBU asked in a conversational tone. "But you do well not to startle us. Someone could have gotten hurt." "It's authentic," Kurenai said after a moment. "And it's probably not a good idea to startle us either." She nodded her head toward the 30 or so Narutos dropping out of the trees behind the ANBU. "We sensed them," the chrome-masked ANBU spoke up. "It's a lot of bunshin, but they're hardly likely to distract us from you." Kurenai smiled sweetly as they turned to leave for their camp. "Not bunshin," she corrected. "Kaga bunshin." One of the clones, smirking, smashed his fist into a tree, splintering the bark. The ANBU twitched at the sudden sound. It only required a handful of minutes to break down the tents and pack up their equipment. Hinata left most of the meat and gathered greens for the ANBU to use, but Naruto made a special point of gathering the leftovers from Hinata's cooking. She blushed a little when he said that it was too good to leave for strangers. He was starting to get an idea of why she acted so weirdly when he complimented her, but he didn't like where his thoughts were taking him. So he left it alone for a while. Within the hour they were on the road back to Konoha. Naruto felt some of the tension flow out of his body as they left the borderlands. It would be good to return home, where hot showers and ramen could be found, the latter in large quantities. As he adjusted his heavy backpack, he glanced over at Hinata. She didn't seem to be as eager to return. Naruto thought about that a lot as their steps carried them home. Chapter 9. Yuhi Kurenai couldn't recall ever being quite so relieved to see the familiar skyline of Konoha again. The only time that even came close was when she returned alone that time, but she'd been too numbed by the death she had seen to feel much of anything. She was annoyed to find herself unconsciously smoothing her sleeve, but the fabric wasn't stiff with Matai's blood. Perhaps Sarutobi was correct about her living far too much in the past. She glanced back at her genin team, proud of the way they maintained their formation and remained alert. Only the occasional smile from one of them indicated that they weren't still in the border zone. Shino, of course, was as reserved and taciturn as usual, even disregarding how little of his face was visible. Hinata had been quiet since they'd received orders to return to Konoha, and her face seemed to settle into a mask as the gates appeared in the distance. No, it was Naruto who was different. The blonde genin had changed since the day he'd finally revealed the truth to his teammates. Kurenai wasn't normally one to become overly smug, but she'd been exactly right about the effects of him opening up to Shino and Hinata. A weight, present for as long as she'd known him, seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. She knew that her acceptance of him had made a difference, but the acceptance of his peers, especially given the implications of the Hokage's law, seemed even more crucial. Rather than rejecting or fearing him, as the Sandaime seemed to fear, Hinata and Shino had accepted the presence of the Kyuubi within Naruto in as positive a way as Kurenai could have hoped. Indeed, if what she'd pieced together was correct, Hinata had reacted in a rather violent way to the implication that Naruto was a monster. Nothing else could explain the distant shout that had carried up from the stream. Kurenai grew more concerned for her other students now. After her father's abominable behavior at their camp, she wasn't surprised that Hinata seemed to dread returning to Konoha. More surprising was the undercurrent of anger she seemed to sense in Shino. The boy was as quiet as ever, but his forehead, the only portion of his face fully visible, seemed to be furrowed with a frown more and more often. When she'd asked him if anything was the matter during a rest stop, he'd merely said that he was being forced to re-evaluate his assessments of a large number of parties. This was unusually opaque, even for an Aburame, but he seemed to be feeling an echo of her own anger regarding how Konoha dealt with certain issues. All the same, she needed to caution the boy to be circumspect. If her suspicions were true, there might be a deeper issue than simple bigotry, not something a genin should be directly involved in, no matter how talented he might be. She supposed she might be hopelessly paranoid, but she'd rather that than to repeat the mistakes of the past. Maybe Yumino Irika would be ready for a visitor after they reported to the Hokage. Aburame Shino let his body move automatically, his teammates and allies alert for danger, while his mind composed a list of people. At the top of the list, of course, were his parents, especially his father. While he appreciated the strictures the Hokage's law forced him to operate under, Shino did not appreciate the paucity of hard information that his clan had acquired before formulating their opinion of Uzumaki Naruto. He hadn't missed the concerned silence among many of his relatives when his team assignment had been announced. Even more galling was the realization that he'd allowed their unreasoning distaste for the prankster to color his own opinions while they were both students at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Shino did not know whether it was more annoying to realize he'd been wrong, or that he'd picked up their attitude without realizing it. Either way, it was past time for him to realign some people's attitudes to make them more congruent with the reality of the situation. In short, he was highly offended. That was the only word that really fit. His clan had compromised the integrity of his logic and his objectivity. And that was completely unacceptable. Not for the last time, Shino heard the low buzz as his new colony became agitated. He forced himself to let his aggravation abate. It would not upset his new allies. Hinata felt her stomach contract with dread as the gates of Konoha appeared in the distance. She loved her village, but in this situation, she dreaded what the sight of it symbolized. Their mission was coming to an end. The border patrol had been a dangerous, dirty, strenuous job. Her muscles still ached, with or without the weights, from the endless patrols they'd run. Despite bathing in the stream as often as possible, she still felt grimy, and her jacket was several shades of gray darker than when she left, due to the buildup of ground-in dirt. She'd been in dangerous situations more than once, and if it hadn't been for Naruto, she would likely have died trying to rescue Hanabi. Yet, it had also been one of the happiest times of her life. It was puzzling at first, the joy she'd taken in such a difficult mission. It wasn't until she thought back on her father's visit to Team 8's campsite that it began to sink in. It was reasonable for him to join the pursuit of Hanabi's kidnappers, and to make sure every means was used to secure her freedom and guarantee the safety of the Hyuga bloodline. Nonetheless, it had felt wrong for him to be there. The campsite that they had spent so much time preparing, the camp that had witnessed so many meals and idle conversations with her team, had felt violated by her father's presence. When Hinata realized that she didn't want him to be there, she was initially scandalized by her blatant disrespect. He was her father, and more importantly the head of the clan. She should have felt honored by his presence, however fleeting. She tried to make him and the others feel welcome, preparing as good a meal as could be managed in such rustic surroundings, but she was too slow, and that had been thwarted as well. Even now, her face burned at the thought of all the wasted food, the sign of a foolish host. She regretted it later, but she'd been gratified that Naruto and Shino ate so much, even as she realized that they were doing it solely to save her feelings. Just thinking about her teammates made her wish they were leaving for another patrol, rather than returning from one. She knew she'd sleep better in the small tent she shared with Kurenai-sensei than in her soft bed in the Hyuga compound. A place where no one wanted a failure like her. Naruto's heart sped up when he saw the gates of Konoha. Their mission was coming to an end. More importantly, everyone was returning under their own power. Shino's burned wrist was hardly more than an annoyance at this point, and the larger boy made a point of sparring with Naruto more than once on the way back. Shino was a little careful how he blocked with that arm, but when Naruto found himself unconsciously easing up on his teammate, the bug user blew him off his feet with a side thrust kick that drove the air from his lungs. Naruto shook his head at the memory of rolling to his feet, gasping, only to see Shino standing in a taijutsu stance, right arm extended and making a come here gesture with his fingers. After that he relaxed and went all out against his friend, and they were both thoroughly bruised within half an hour. Friend. That word again. He wondered if Kurenai-sensei ever got tired of being right all the time. It made a huge difference to know that Shino and Hinata knew about the Kyuubi, and just didn't care. Moreover, Shino figured it out on his own, and Hinata had guessed. His teammates would have to have been extremely dense or self-centered for him to be able to conceal his differences for much longer. But they knew, and more importantly, they accepted him. He didn't think he'd ever forget the shock when Hinata had just exploded like that. He never imagined that she could ever get angry like that, but watching her get absolutely furious on his behalf, that was an odd feeling. Unsettling but nice. However, as they returned to Konoha, the kunoichi became increasingly quiet and withdrawn. Naruto wasn't the most perceptive shinobi in his class, but the change in her demeanor was more than obvious to him. It was puzzling, especially in its timing. They were leaving the danger zone now, and returning to a safe area, as safe as any village full of shinobi, that is. Naruto was looking forward to some civilized amenities involving heated water, ramen and showers, and he would have thought Hinata would as well. At least the showers anyway. Instead, she looked increasingly uncomfortable as they approached the gates. He wondered about some things he'd learned during their mission. Hanabi was a brat, of that there was no question. Naruto had no siblings, but he'd heard Kiba complain about his older sister often enough to realize that brothers and sisters didn't always get along. On the other hand, her father should have been proud of the way Hinata had rescued her sister. Instead, he and that jerk cousin of hers looked at Hinata like it was her fault Hanabi had been kidnapped in the first place. Naruto didn't understand it. But he didn't have to understand it to know he didn't like it. Uzumaki Naruto rubbed at the back of his head as he thought it over. Thinking like this wasn't one of his strengths, but Kurenai-sensei had been pushing him more and more to see underneath the underneath. It was a really goofy phrase that meant trying to understand all the subtle undercurrents in a situation. It was a good skill for a shinobi to develop, because on a mission, unseen things could end your life. On the other hand, Naruto didn't think it was supposed to be applied to understanding kunoichis. But for all that, it wasn't too hard to put together. He remembered how tired and sore Hinata had been from that special Hyuga training, and how she seemed to revive once they were out in the woods. He remembered the long hours she volunteered to do extra training with him, and her embarrassed silence when he'd asked if her family wouldn't object to her working so late and missing dinner. Combining that with the cold way her father had treated her at the campsite led Naruto to only one inescapable conclusion. Hinata's family sucked worse than cold ramen. Naruto was about to congratulate himself on his perceptiveness when the natural follow-up question left him stumped. What could he possibly do about it? He didn't think beating the crap out of Hyuga Hayashi would help, even if he were capable of such a thing. Puzzling over this eroded any sense of triumph he'd gleaned from his realization. Furtive glances at his teammate seemed to confirm his guess, as her gaze seemed to sink lower and lower toward the ground as she approached the walls of Konoha. Naruto's mood sank as well. Even though he thought he knew the source of the problem, he couldn't think of anything he could do to help. He hated feeling helpless, especially when one of his friends was hurting, but how could he protect her from her family? He let out a sigh as they passed through the gates, causing Yuhi Kurenai to glance back at him. Maybe Kurenai-sensei will know what to do, he mused. A little weight seemed to lift from his shoulders at the thought. He'd never seen her at a loss before. Well, maybe except for that one time with the Lee spandex hinge. In accordance with standing orders, no sooner had Kurenai reported to the Chunin guarding the Hokage's door than they were ushered into his office. The old man was concerned, but he still smiled as Team 8 filed into the room and stood before him. They stood at attention, but he waved over one of the Chunins and folding chairs were brought for all of them. This may take a while, he explained. But before we begin your official debriefing, he began, setting down his pipe, I want to personally thank you for my grandson's safety. Konoha Maru still grumbles about having to be saved by his eternal rival. The old man paused, smiling as Naruto rolled his eyes, but I can tell from his eyes that it was a very close thing. I can't tell you how relieved I am, or how proud I am that you are all shinobi of the leaf. The three genin all looked down, clearly embarrassed from his praise. The Hokage cleared his throat and asked Yuhi Kurenai to make her official report. He listened intently as she summarized the events of the last few weeks, but he did stop her at some points for clarification. They mistook Naruto for the Yondaime? He asked, both startled and alarmed at that revelation. That is correct, Hokage-sama, Kurenai confirmed. The IWA shinobi grew quite alarmed at his presence, but they did not seek to test our vigilance again after that initial confrontation. Sarutobi rubbed at his chin as he pondered this. A quiet border is a blessing, but I will send a communique to our representative in Earth Country to explain their mistake. I would rather they did not feel that we were provoking them in such a fashion. Send them my grades from the academy, Aji-san, Naruto said with a grin. Let them know they were scared of the dead last in his class. Sandaime was shocked by two things. The first was the fact that Naruto would make a joke about his poor grades in the academy, something that had previously been a sore point with him. He couldn't imagine him bringing that up, even for the opportunity to make someone else look foolish. The other was the reactions of his teammates. The little Hyuga girl turned toward Naruto, eyebrows drawing together and mouth half opened. She hesitated, and the Hokage imagined that his presence was the only thing preventing her from protesting Naruto's words. Even more surprising was the Aburame boy's reaction. He merely turned his head and glared at Naruto. Well, it was impossible to see his eyes, but his body language was unmistakable. Naruto's reaction supported the Hokage's assessment as well, for he immediately flushed and scratched the back of his head, smiling sheepishly. I was just kidding, he mumbled. Beside them, Kurenai kept her face immobile, but her eyes were dancing with a mixture of pride and vindication. Sarutobi gave her a small nod of agreement. He was gratified to witness that Naruto was less defensive, and that he had made such loyal friends of his teammates. Perhaps one day the boy would be able to share his secret with others of his generation. The light mood darkened as Kurenai began to describe the battle against the kidnappers. He was a little surprised to learn that the Hyuga Hinata initiated the engagement, but her sensei made a point of explaining the rushed nature of the interception and how she fully supported Hinata's reasoning. He also noticed Naruto nudging the girl, who was looking down and blushing. Yuhi Kurenai is not one to lightly praise another's logic, the old man observed, making Kurenai grimace as the girl's blush deepened. The ability to make sound judgments on the spur of the moment is not one to take lightly. Arigato, Hokage-sama, the girl said in a quiet voice. As Kurenai described the battle, which had been as brutal as it was abrupt, the Hokage's tension was only visible in a slight tightening of the weathered skin around his eyes. One of the hardest parts of this job, at least for him, was hearing about the battles of his shinobi after the fact, too late for him to do anything about it. The blood was already drawn, the lives ended. The only thing he could do now was try to draw as many lessons as possible from the now concluded missions. He winced internally when he learned of Shino's burns, but the bandages on his arm were compact, and he did not seem to favor it. He grew alarmed for other reasons when he heard how Hinata was stunned by a lucky hunk of ice. With only Kurenai and Naruto facing three opponents. At this point, Kurenai continued, I heard Naruto shout as I fought Lasuk. He successfully drew on Kyuubi's chakra and used it to shield him from the flames so he was able to close with his opponent, and... She stopped as the Hokage's hand slammed down upon the desk. He stared at his, wondering what possessed her to break the law concerning, and then he noticed that her genin was all staring at him. And while they might have been startled by his outburst, they didn't seem to have reacted to her casual mention of the nine-tailed fox. They already know, Naruto said quietly, his voice sounding far too old for the energetic prankster he knew. Shino figured it out on his own, and Hinata mostly guessed it. But I confirmed it, so no one broke your law. And we did not run screaming into the night, Shino murmured. Hinata frowned, and Sarutobi noticed her hand twitch, like she wanted to reach out to her teammate, but the motion ended almost as soon as it began, and he doubted anyone else even noticed. Naruto the Hokage began, then stopped to consider his words. It's good to know that they accept you. Perhaps I was being too cautious when I made that law, but I decided to err on the side of caution regarding your future. Naruto looked up and locked eyes with the third Hokage. I understand, was all he said, but it still shook the old man to his core. The boy's eyes were an odd mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, and loneliness so poignant it shriveled his soul. But overriding all the rest was another emotion, forgiveness. Maybe there were better ways the whole situation could have been handled, but Naruto acknowledged that he tried his best. It was both a liberating and a humbling experience. He wondered what else the boy had gone through during the mission. Kurenai continued her narrative. He was a little shocked and saddened that Naruto had been put in the position of having to kill 2 of the kidnappers. But all that was forgotten when he heard the words and I learned that his psychological preparation at the academy had been sabotaged. However, we were able to discuss what he should have learned, and… Sabotaged? He asked sharply. Yes, Hokage, she replied. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. Naruto looked somewhat uncomfortable, but his teammates were staring at their Hokage, almost daring him to speak. Give me a written summary of his actions, he said in a hard voice. Once I have reviewed it, I will have him brought to Ibiki. Thank you, Hokage-sama, Kurenai said. Naruto and Hinata looked mystified, but the Aburame boy merely nodded approvingly. Sarutobi had little doubt that Aburame Shibi had acquainted his son with the names of Konoha's important shinobi. The chief interrogation specialist would definitely be on his list, the old man mused as Kurenai resumed her report. When she was done, the Hokage gave each of them a labeled envelope. Here is your pay for an extended C-class mission, he said. He then took out 3 more envelopes with official Konoha seals on them. These are for the 3 missing nuns that were eliminated, he continued. There were substantial bounties placed on their heads by their home villages, as well as other people they'd committed crimes against. He gave one of the envelopes to Kurenai, and tried to hand the other 2 to Naruto, but the blonde boy shook his head. Naruto, Kurenai said gently, you've saved some people a lot of trouble by your actions. It's all right to accept this reward. For many of their victims, offering a bounty is the only way they can strike back at someone who had hurt them or their family. That's not what I mean, Sensei, Naruto corrected her, his voice grave. I understand the rewards, but these 2 shouldn't be for me alone. We fought as a team. I mean, I wouldn't even have seen them if Hinata hadn't spotted them through there, right? I know, Naruto, it's all right, the girl said hesitantly. But the boy just shook his head stubbornly. By the rules, Naruto struck the killing blows, Kurenai observed. But that means the money is his to do with as he will. If he wishes to share with his teammates, then so be it. I can get all 3 of these vouchers cashed, and we can split the rewards. Sensei, Naruto said quickly, I didn't mean you had to. Kurenai cut him off with a gesture. I just happen to agree with you, Naruto. And am I not a member of the team as well? She turned back toward the Hokage. You will have a written report of my observations by tomorrow morning, she promised in a tight voice. The third Hokage of Konohagakure dismissed Team 8 with a bemused smile on his face. He really should have talked Kurenai into taking a genin team long before now. He hadn't seen a team that seemed so in tune with each other since. It was hard, dreadfully hard, not to let other faces overshadow the young ones before him. His own genin, that grew up to become the Sannin, the Yandame's first and last genin team, the Nara Kimichi Yamanaka trios that seemed to crop up in each generation, they were all unique, really. The human mind just tries to find patterns to make sense of life, even when there are none to be found. But it didn't require a historical perspective to realize that Kurenai's genin had grown together as a team, and had done so to a greater extent than many experienced shinobi even realized was possible. Hatake Kakashi might understand, when he wasn't too distracted by the ghosts of his past. And while Kurenai had done an excellent job assembling her team, much like a skilled mason might build a brick wall capable of withstanding anything, the Hokage also realized something else. While Kurenai was the mason, Naruto was the mortar that held them all together. Their acceptance had given him something he'd always craved without even being able to understand why. But at the same time, his awkward and often foolish demeanor masked a drive and a wisdom of a sort that the Sandaime only caught rare glimpses of during their infrequent talks. For someone with few real friends, Naruto was amazingly open and accepting. As he'd anticipated, once someone showed the boy some simple kindness, they discovered they'd also made a friend for life, one of surprising loyalty and determination. The third Hokage sighed and rubbed at his eyes. He got up from his chair and paced around his office, wincing at the pops and crackles as his old bones realigned themselves after sitting too long. He paused near the window and looked out across his beloved Konoha, toward the Hokage monument. His eyes lingered on the stone visage of his successor, and sadly enough, predecessor as well. "You did better than you knew," the old man whispered before returning to his paperwork. Oddly enough, Kurenai did not immediately dismiss them once they left the Hokage's office. Naruto frowned a little when she said they had one more task to perform as a team, but that ended the moment she said it was a tradition she'd learned from her old sensei. It didn't take a genius to realize that Kurenai-sensei never talked about her original team, except in the most general of terms. Having been around shinobi much of his life, Naruto noticed how many of them would mention their old teachers or teammates. According to Shikamaru's complaints, his father did little else when they talked, much to the lazy boy's annoyance. However troublesome such habits might be for others, it only made the exceptions to the rule that much more noticeable. Naruto was curious as to why Kurenai never talked of them, but he hesitated to ask. Kurenai was a very private person in some ways, despite her forthright nature, and he suspected that her reasons for not speaking of them were sad ones. It wasn't that Naruto ever forgot that they were all shinobi, trained assassins who could be assigned any mission, no matter how dangerous, for the good of their village. But after a while the dangers just seemed so normal that it was hard to keep them in the forefront of his mind. And perhaps that was for the best, because every time he even considered the possibility of losing his teammates on a mission, his mind sheared away from the enormity of that potential loss. Not for the first time, he realized that he literally would rather die than suffer the loss of one of the few people that cared for him. Kurenai-sensei said that she never expected Naruto to intercept every attack aimed at Shino or Hinata, but that was exactly what he wanted to do. He'd do whatever it took to keep his friends safe. Anything at all. Naruto felt the hairs on the back of his neck begin to rise and realized with a start that the unnatural chakra he'd felt during the battle was returning. Remembering Kurenai's words, he took a deep breath and made an effort to calm himself. He clenched and unclenched his hands, trying to ignore how sharp his fingernails were becoming, and hoping that his canines didn't look as large as they suddenly felt. He looked up at his teammates, to remind himself that they were all right. Shino was walking silently beside Kurenai, hunched inside of his spare trench coat. Hinata was walking beside Naruto, seemingly lost in thought. Though she walked with her eyes downcast, Naruto noticed that she'd fully adapted to her weights, and walked as gracefully as ever with their mass added to her arms and legs. Somehow the sight of her seemed to calm him, quelling the rising tide of anxiety about the future that wanted to overwhelm him. He could feel his body returning to what, for him, counted as normal. Almost as if she were sensing his thoughts, Hinata glanced toward Naruto, only to jump a little when she locked eyes with him. Her face turned red and she clasped her hands together. "Ayano?" she asked hesitantly. "Looks like you're ready to increase your weights again, Hinata-chan," Naruto said brightly, relieved that the anxious pressure building inside of him was draining away. "Oh," Hinata said, looking crestfallen. Sorry," she stammered, "I should have noticed sooner, An." Naruto frowned and her words cut off suddenly, and she looked away. Why was she always apologizing for things that were not her fault? You know, Hinata, we've been out in the woods for several weeks. It's not like you could buy extra weights from a squirrel. The kunoichi didn't respond to his lame attempt at humor, and just looked down at her feet as they walked. Naruto sighed. He didn't know why his words always came out weird when he talked to Hinata, but he was getting tired of it. "Look," he said. "I was just trying to say that you've fully adapted to wearing the weights. Probably because you work really hard and probably slept with the damn things on. I need to get more weight added to mine as well. I'm sorry if it came out wrong, but I was trying to say nice work. And I'm really glad you're on my team, too. I can't picture Ino or Sakura working as hard as you have." There, he thought with some satisfaction, no way can she take that wrong. He smiled at his teammate. Hinata was left several paces behind as her legs momentarily froze in place. Her face turned bright red and Naruto wouldn't have been surprised if her hair started to smoke and frizz up. He blinked, then ran back and waved his hand in front of Hinata's eyes, startling her out of her daze. She ducked her head down with a small smile and they turned to follow their teammates. Only to discover that Kurenai and Shino had turned around as well, and were staring at them. Naruto shrugged and scratched the back of his head with a sheepish grin. At least he'd made himself understood properly. It was about time. Hinata managed to get her face back under control by the time Kurenai-sensei led them to their destination. She found it difficult to concentrate after Naruto's blunt, but honest words. She realized he was mirroring her words to him when she reassured him that she still wanted him to stay on Team 8, QB and all, but it still shocked her when he said that he'd rather have her on his team than Ino or Sakura. Especially when she considered all the times he tried to ask Sakura out when they were in the academy. Naruto was glad she was his teammate. Her, the Hyuga reject, who failed everything she ever tried to do except maybe at being Naruto's friend? She knew she'd helped him, at least a little, that day by the stream, even if she had gone about it all wrong. She supposed she should be grateful to the fates. If she were only going to be allowed to do one thing right, then this would be the one that she would pick. Hinata's bemused thoughts cut off in surprise when Kurenai led them to Morite's for their last task of the day. The Jonin's face was even more somber than usual as she explained that her sensei always brought his team here after a long mission away from Konoha to discuss the mission, plan what they would work on next, and generally celebrate their success. Hinata knew from the way their sensei always spoke of them in the past tense that Kurenai-sensei's team was no more. She was nowhere near as skilled at reading people as a proper Hyuga should be, but she didn't have to be to know that something dreadful must have happened to them. Shino and Naruto seemed to pick up on this as well, because they were silent as Kurenai led them inside, greeted the owner with a nod, and settled them at a table in a darkened corner. Despite their stated purpose of celebrating and coming there, they were all silent as they waited for their orders to arrive. Kurenai seemed extremely distracted by something, and frowned off into the distance. Hinata noticed Naruto fidgeting nervously. If she wasn't used to the frequent formal dinners at the Hyuga compound, she'd probably do the same. Finally, Naruto could no longer contain himself and spoke up. "Sensei?" he asked. "What was your Jonin sensei like?" Kurenai froze with her sake halfway to her lips and Hinata held her breath. While she was equally curious, she couldn't believe Naruto had just asked their sensei like that. "Why do you want to know?" Kurenai asked in a far too quiet voice. Hinata had only seen Kurenai become really angry once, after speaking to her father. She'd come out of the conversation possessed by a cold fury that was frankly terrifying. She didn't understand what her father had said to provoke such a reaction, but she knew she never wanted to see such rage in her senses again. Naruto's voice took on an unusually thoughtful tone as he stared into the distance. For an instant, Hinata pictured his unusually somber expression under the Hokage's traditional hat, and felt a shudder of premonition. Was she watching fates change before her eyes? "He was your sensei," was all Naruto said after a moment. To their surprise, Shino spoke up as well. "If he's had anywhere near as large an effect on you, as you have had on your students, then a desire to know more about him is only logical." "Yeah," Naruto added, nodding, "that almost makes him our sensei as well, doesn't it?" "I would be honored to hear of him as well," Hinata heard herself adding. She was horrified at the thought of prying into potentially painful memories, but Naruto and Shino's reasons had moved her. And she had to back up her teammates as well. Kurenai-sensei was quiet for a moment as the waitress brought out their orders. After she left, though, they began to talk. Kobara-sensei was not the sort of person you would picture as a shinobi. He was even stockier than Sarutobi Asuma, who works with your classmates on Team 10, and Kobara was nearly a head taller. As a teammate once said, he looked like a boulder that had grown legs and gone for a walk. With his size and strength, he was formidable with taijutsu, but he always said only a fool hunts with one arrow in his quiver, so he made a point of learning. Hinata sat, utterly still, as her sensei's voice painted a vivid picture of the man who'd played a major role in making her the kunoichi that sat before them. Their food sat, cooling and forgotten. It was after dark before they left Morite's. It was odd for Naruto to feel like he'd come to know someone he'd never met, but it was a good sort of odd. He could see where Kurenai-sensei had learned a lot from the man, but added her own spin to his lessons before she passed them on. He wondered what he would teach his genins when he was a. Hopefully by that time everyone would have forgotten about sexy no jutsu. If they didn't, he was going to have a little talk with Konohamaru. Naruto shook his head at that thought. When Kurenai dismissed them, the pensive gave them the next day off to rest and replace any damaged or worn gear. It was well past visiting hours at the hospital, but he'd make time to visit Irika-sensei tomorrow. Naruto grimaced at the thought of all the laundry he needed to do before he went to sleep. The sooner he resumed working with Guy and Lee, the less pain would be involved in catching up. Tomorrow morning he would seek them out again. Maybe Guy would have some heavier weights he could borrow. Naruto's musings were interrupted as Shino and his sensei said their goodbyes. He turned toward Hinata, but the slump of her shoulders suggested that she was less than enthusiastic about going home. Naruto frowned as he wondered how accurate his conclusions about her family were. If he wasn't delusional, that might explain why she lingered outside the restaurant instead of immediately going home. Hinata? He asked. Hinata jumped and looked up from the fingers she was absently pressing together. Why yes, Naruto? I'm going to do some extra training tomorrow with Guy-sensei and Lee, if they aren't out on a mission. Would you like to come as well? He asked. Ayano, she said hesitantly as her cheeks reddened slightly, wouldn't that be rude? To come uninvited? Nah, Naruto said. I'll just tell Guy that you were so impressed with my progress that you wanted to see his training methods. He'll go crazy, so just nod politely every time he says something about that power of youth thing. He shook his head. And don't look at their teeth when they smile or you'll be rubbing the spots out of your eyes for a while. Hinata's eyes widened at Naruto's open duplicity. I mean I can't. Naruto nodded, quickly bouncing on the balls of his feet. Sure you can. He's actually nice, in his own weird way. And Lee really wants to beat your cousin, who is his eternal rival, and practicing with another Juken user can only help him, right? Hinata nodded slowly. Great, Naruto said with a smile. But you better get some sleep. Those two keep some really early hours. Can you meet me in front of Ichiraku's at 5:30? Hinata smiled a little this time, and Naruto felt an odd sense of accomplishment. Hi, she said, agreeing. See you in the morning, Hinata-chan, he called out as he raced toward his apartment. He needed to get his laundry going, take as hot a shower as he could stand, and then reacquaint himself with his bed. Hinata stared after the boy as he left, wondering what she'd just gotten herself into. If Naruto actually wanted her there, she supposed she could deal with the awkwardness. If Guy and Lee didn't want her around, she doubted they'd be shy about letting her know. No one else was. She tried not to dwell on where she was going as her feet carried her home. The branch family member on duty acknowledged her return with the barest of nods as she entered the compound. Hinata was relieved she was able to slip into her father's house without encountering anyone. Once in her room, with the door shut, she let out a shuddering breath and tried to relax. She unpacked her bag, setting out the items that desperately needed cleaning. The uniform she was wearing was definitely in that category as well, so she changed into a bathing robe and, after setting out her laundry, crept into the bathroom for a long soak. The hot water soothed her muscles, but just being in this house was increasing her mental tension. She wasn't wanted here. She didn't belong here. She was a failure in a clan that didn't tolerate failures. The realization she'd come to on the way back to Konoha burned ever brighter in her mind. She didn't want to be here. Naruto's fingers were still tingling from his shinobi alarm clock when he arrived in front of Ichiraku's. Hinata had evidently arrived a little early, and was watching the old man fuss over his stove as he prepared for another busy day. He waved goodbye, promising they'd be back for breakfast, and led Hinata to Guy and Lee's favorite training ground. Naruto, Guy called out as they entered the clearing. I heard your team had returned to Konoha, flush with victory and the fire of youth. Are you ready for more steps on the path to become a genius of hard work? Yeah, Naruto said, rubbing at the back of his neck while Hinata stared at the odd duo. And I brought someone who works even harder than I do. Yash! Lee cried out. My favorite sparring partner and rival of hard work has returned to Konoha. Naruto wasn't sure if it was possible, but his eyebrows seemed even thicker than he'd remembered. Lee! You are so passionate. You are truly my student. Tears were streaming from the Jonin's eyes, making them sparkle unnaturally in the dim morning light. Guy-sensei! Lee! Guy-sensei! Lee! Naruto said, interrupting the happy duo. He could have sworn that he heard music off in the distance. This is Hyuga Hinata, he said, nudging the dubious-looking girl forward. Guy said, distracted from their cacophonous duet. You must be the cousin of my student Niji. Hi, Hinata said, bowing quickly. Naruto thought she looked like she wanted to bolt out of the clearing and hide. She's heard me brag about your incredible training techniques, Naruto said quickly. And she wanted to see for herself. I think they are probably superior to the Hyuga methods, but only Hinata can judge that for certain. Hinata spun toward Naruto, her mouth hanging open in shock. The blonde shinobi had been a little worried about laying it on too thickly with the green clad. He shouldn't have wasted his energy. Yash! The fire of youth extends even into the cold Hyuga clan, Guy exclaimed happily. Niji is a genius, but he lacks Lee's fire and enthusiasm. I will be more than happy to fan the fires of her determination to excel. Hinata gaped at as he and Lee broke into another chorus. She turned to Naruto, her expression puzzled. That means you are more than welcome to train with us, Hinata-chan, Naruto translated with a grin and a roll of his eyes. As they set to work, Naruto braced himself for an unpleasant task, getting caught up to Lee again. The spandex-clad genin was even faster than he remembered, and while Naruto wore his weights on the border patrol mission, he couldn't afford to train himself to exhaustion in hostile territory. At first, all Naruto could see were green blurs as he tried to block a typhoon of kicks and punches. Even when he did successfully block, Naruto had to lock his stance to avoid being blown off his feet. He could feel his sandals skidding backward on the grass. He grew frustrated enough to anchor his feet to the ground with chakra, only to have Lee go aerial on him, and send him flying with a spinning jump kick that went over his block. Naruto tumbled when he hit the ground, finally skidding on his shoulders and back as he tried to get his eyes to focus. Then he pulled his knees up to his chest and did a kip up. He was a little dizzy, but his feet were steady. I see you got soft while I was away, Naruto said cockily, even as his vision swam slightly. That should have knocked me out. Yash! Lee shouted and came at him again. As Naruto's blood got moving, his aches faded away in the excitement of combat. Lee scored 3 more solid hits, but Naruto sprang to his feet even faster and returned to the battle. Finally, he successfully ducked away from one of Lee's palm heel strikes, and managed to grab the boy's elbow before he could pull back. Lee chopped at Naruto's elbow, but the blonde's other hand grabbed that wrist before it could connect. Naruto forced his hands apart, yanking Lee temporarily off balance, and right into the knee. Naruto slammed into his stomach, even as his forehead cracked into Lee's jaw. Lee staggered back, gasping for breath and rubbing at his jaw. It's great to have you back, Naruto-san, he exclaimed happily. He turned to Guy. Sensei, do you think I can attempt that move again? Guy frowned thoughtfully, his eyes wandering over Naruto, and then Hinata. With me here to supervise, I think it will be safe. Naruto, Hinata, and Lee have been working hard to perfect a special finishing move. He would like to work with Naruto for his first attempt, but it is important that no one mention this move with others. It is to be Lee's secret weapon. His voice rose at the end, and he gave one of those nice guy poses that made his teeth shine with unnatural brightness. All right, Naruto said dubiously. Then he shook his head. Guy wouldn't let him be injured. Even if this was a finishing move, Kurenai-sensei would kill him. For all his quirks, Mato Guy didn't appear to be suicidal. All the same, Naruto couldn't help but gulp as he dropped into a defensive stance. Lee had his hands clasped together and gasped, "First gate, open!" Then he disappeared in a blur of motion. Naruto's eyes had just begun to track downward when Lee's foot drove upward into his stomach, launching him into the air. He heard Lee shout "Kagebayo," and suddenly he could see his sparring partner out of the corner of his eye, leaping into the air behind him, in a parallel arc. Naruto felt something wrapping around his arms. He looked down as he struggled to free himself. It looked like Lee's arm bandages. Then the boy's arms wrapped around his upper arms in a grip of iron. "Omote wrench!" Lee shouted as they began to spin rapidly. As he struggled to break free, a corner of his mind observed that he was very lucky to have not eaten breakfast yet. It was hard to tell with all the spinning, but Naruto thought they had passed the top of their shared trajectory, and were now shooting toward the ground at high speed. As he frantically tried to break free, he realized the purpose of this strange attack. With the way Lee gripped him, his head would strike the ground first, with their combined momentum behind it. Truly a deadly technique. Naruto's appreciation of the technique was, of course, marred by the fact that he was about to become its first victim. He was seriously considering calling on the red chakra when the two of them jarred to a halt. "That's enough," Guy shouted as he caught the two of them. With Lee's grip relaxed, Naruto was able to burst out of the bandages. He tried to turn around and immediately fell to the ground, too dizzy to walk. Did I do it right? Lee asked in a worried tone as leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. If you didn't, I don't ever want to see the right version, Naruto groaned as he tried to swallow. Empty or not, his stomach was feeling rather delicate at the moment. That launching kick certainly hadn't helped either. He saw Hinata, out of the corner of his eye, watching anxiously. He gave her a small wave and she looked down with a sigh of relief. Yes, Lee Guy said, pausing dramatically. You have mastered the Omote Range, he shouted. Such a flowery name for a move that plants your opponent like a turnip, Naruto groused as he tried to climb to his feet, sternly addressing his rebellious inner ear. How Lee was able to stand up at all was completely beyond him. Yes, Naruto, Guy said as he helped the genin stand up. It's a very dangerous move, and only to be used in extreme circumstances. Is that understood, Lee? Lee nodded, and then pulled out a small notepad and pencil and began writing. Yes, sensei. Now that I know I can do it, I will only use it in extreme circumstances. When I tell your teammates of your success in the first phase of your initial training, they will be so proud. Guy exclaimed. Yash, Guy sensei. Lee agreed. Lee. Guy sensei. At this point Naruto's stomach had enough and he vomited on Guy's sandals. Sorry, he murmured as he stumbled backwards, still feeling like the world was spinning around him. The after effects were more severe than I anticipated, Guy exclaimed, raising one besmeared foot and frowning at it. Make a note of that, Lee. Yes, sensei, Lee replied with a serious expression, notepad in hand. Paradoxically, Naruto felt better after puking, which didn't make much sense to him. A light touch on his shoulder made him turn his head. Hinata offered him a clean cloth and a cup of tea from her thermos. Naruto accepted both gratefully, realizing that she seemed to always be prepared for any emergency with her bag, something he would do well to emulate. While Naruto-san recovers, would you do us the honor, Hyuga-sama? Guy asked politely. Hinata's face immediately reddened, but after an encouraging smile from Naruto, she nodded. Watching Hinata spar with Lee was interesting, and soon Naruto's spasming stomach was forgotten. Lee was still pretty fast, but doing the Omote wrench seemed to have taken a lot out of him. Nevertheless, after the first few exchanges with the Hyuga girl, he started to go all out again. Naruto noticed Hinata doing many of the things she used against him when they sparred. He supposed his personal taijutsu style had been influenced by Guy and Lee's, but it was still illuminating to see his teammate flow around Lee's attack and make delicate-seeming strikes that left the boy moving slower and slower. Finally, she got through his guard and scored a glancing blow to his left shoulder that made the whole arm freeze up. Lee jumped back with a frown, rubbing at the joint. Just like with Niji, he groaned. Lee, do not let yourself become discouraged, Guy said in a serious voice. Naruto-san, you regularly spar with Hinata, do you not? Hi. Naruto agreed with a nod, ignoring the way Hinata's fingers were pushing together again. How do you defend against her juken strikes? He asked. Well, Naruto said slowly, trying to ignore the way Lee had his notepad out again, hanging on his every word. I usually can't block them directly without getting zapped, and slowing down until she has me at her mercy. He said the last bit with a straight face, but grinned at her blush. I have to dodge more and block less. In fact, unless I am close enough to block her upper arms, I don't block at all. Otherwise, she pushes chakra into my arm muscles or one of my points, and that hurts. He shrugged. I have to come in at odd angles a lot more. And I have to be ready to reopen any that gets closed. Reopen? Guy asked sharply. Naruto nodded. Yes, if I push a hunk of chakra towards that point on my body, it usually pops back open. He shrugged. Hurts like hell, though, like that pins and needles feeling, only about 100 times worse. I see, Guy said dubiously. Lee's eyes had gone wide, however. Sensei, can I learn to do this? Naruto shrugged. Hinata helped me figure out how, he said. Now Lee and both genin were staring at the Hyuga girl, causing her cheeks to glow a bright red. Ayano, she said hesitantly, Naruto did most of it himself. I just told him when it seemed to be working. Still, Lee's enthusiasm would not be deterred. After 15 minutes of effort though, Lee's shoulder was just barely able to flex. According to Hinata, his chakra couldn't push quite hard enough to reopen the point she had closed. Lee looked downcast as he told them that the reason he concentrated so much on taijutsu was because his chakra coils were severely underdeveloped. Hinata looked mortified that her technique had forced the proud young genin to admit to his weakness, and Naruto didn't miss the way her hands bunched into fists holding the hem of her jacket. "Hey," he said quickly, causing Lee to look up, "at least you didn't fail the genin exam 3 times like I did." He smiled ruefully. "If Mizuki hadn't been a traitor, I might still be at the academy." Of course, after saying something like that, he had to explain the whole mess that ended with him wearing Iruka-sensei's hitai. Naruto hadn't had much experience telling stories before, but with this audience it was easy. Both Hinata and Lee seemed to hang on his words, and even Gai-sensei listened quietly, nodding thoughtfully. It wasn't until halfway through the tale that he hesitated, wondering how he should handle Mizuki taunting him about the Guy, of course, already knew, as did Hinata. Only Lee was ignorant, but Naruto knew Lee would follow Guy's lead. He'd been right to trust Hinata and Shino, maybe telling Lee would turn out as well. So Mizuki started taunting me about the village's secret law, which made Iruka-sensei really mad. He continued though, telling me about how when the nine-tailed fox attacked Konoha, the yondaime wasn't really able to kill him. No one could. Instead, the Hokage sealed the demon up inside a newborn baby, namely me. Well, suddenly things started making a lot more sense, like how all the adults hated me, because I was holding the demon that killed their loved ones, including Iruka-sensei's parents. I was so shocked I could barely move when Mizuki hurled this huge shuriken at me. Next thing I knew, I was on my back, and Iruka was crouched over me, with that big shuriken stuck out of his back. Naruto paused to catch his breath and check his audience. Lee's unnaturally round eyes were practically bulging from the sockets, and Hinata looked to be on the verge of tears. Guy nodded grimly, though his eyes were bright as well. Iruka told me that he didn't blame me at all, and that he could tell I wasn't a demon. He said we were both alike, and that we grew up very lonely. Naruto's voice trailed off, as he hadn't originally intended to go into that part. Anyway, he continued after a deep breath. Mizuki came after us again, only this time I was more mad than anything else. So I tried the new technique I'd learned from the Forbidden Scroll, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. He grinned. Iruka looked like he was going to have a heart attack, but Mizuki just started screaming as all my clones jumped on him and beat him down. Then Iruka-sensei stood up and told me to close my eyes. When I opened them, he tied his hitai onto my head and told me that I'd passed. "Yosh!" Lee roared, making Naruto and Hinata both jump. "Naruto-san," he continued in a slightly quieter voice, "you are such an inspiration. Surely you are an incarnation of the power of youth." Naruto wasn't so sure about that, since it sounded a little painful. But at least Lee wasn't making his ears ring anymore, so that was something. "Lee is correct, Naruto," Guy added in a more reflective tone as he nodded at the blonde genin. "That was no doubt a very difficult tale to share. Thank you for using it to inspire Lee." "If Naruto can overcome such obstacles," Lee declared, his eyes seeming to catch fire, "then a lack of chakra is nothing. I will find a way to defeat Niji, even without chakra." "If you ever catch him with that turnip planting move, you'll kick his ass," Naruto agreed, his stomach rolling slightly at the memory. "Lee has indeed worked very hard to perfect that move," Guy agreed. "Tonight, we will celebrate his success," he declared. "You two are both invited as well." Hinata's eyes widened, but Naruto answered for both of them. "We'll be there," he said. "Good, good," Guy said, punching the palm of his hand. "Hinata-san, you are welcome to join us any morning you wish. Any assistance you can give Lee will be most welcome. However, I would ask that you not mention any of this to your cousin, Niji. He is highly skilled, but I think it would be good for his training if he were to receive some youthful surprises when he spars. It will demonstrate how he should never underestimate his opponents. Is this acceptable to you?" he asked politely. Hinata nodded, eyes wide. At this point, Naruto and Lee were both recovered, but Guy had Naruto and Hinata spar while he and Lee took copious notes. Hinata seemed a little self-conscious at first, but they soon settled into a quick rhythm of attack and counterattack. Naruto slipped first, and felt a spike of chakra blast through his elbow, locking the joint as capillaries ruptured and the muscles cramped painfully. But he was able to grab Hinata's forearm with his good hand before she could pull back. Naruto rolled backward, planting his feet in Hinata's stomach like he'd done before and launching her into the air. His working hand flashed toward his kunai pouch and he sent a trio of blunted shuriken toward his teammate. Hinata's kunai appeared in her hand like magic and she deflected the 2 shuriken that would have hit her. She tucked her legs up to speed her rotation so she would land feet down. But no sooner did her feet touch the earth than Naruto was right on top of her, a flash of yellow on his palm as his hand brushed the sleeve of her jacket. "Right-un, Shakinga Haji," he said as they discharged. Hinata flinched violently at the shock, but Naruto had summoned just enough electricity for her to feel it, but not enough to hurt. Naruto stepped back, proud of scoring a hit, as well as the proof of his hard-earned chakra control. Then he saw Hinata's head and the grin froze on his face. The electrical discharge left Hinata's hair standing on end, forming an indigo cloud around her head. It was pretty funny, but Naruto refused to laugh at her expense as he massaged his bruised elbow. As the kunoichi settled back into a ready stance, Naruto hesitated. He knew Hinata was easily embarrassed, and the condition of her hair would probably mortify her, as funny as it might be. He was tempted to just not say anything, but Guy and Lee were watching. Finally, it came down to the fact that she was his teammate. If he let it go without saying anything, he was turning his back on that. "Hey Hinata?" he asked. Hinata frowned. But she didn't make a connection between her hair and the vague gestures Naruto was making over the top of his own head. Finally, he just gave up and stepped forward, rapidly patting down her static raised hair. Unfortunately, individual strands wanted to cling to his fingers, so he had to stroke the dark blue hair a couple of times before it would lie flat. He'd been hoping to save the kunoichi from some embarrassment, but her face was bright red when he stepped back. Your hair, it was sticking up from he explained. "Oh," was all Hinata said. Then she dropped into a juken stance and came at him again. By the time they left Guy and Lee, Hinata was as tired and hungry as her teammate professed to be. Even her stomach growled once as they walked back toward town, making Naruto crack up as she looked horrified. "Nay, Hinata," he reassured her, "you're hungry because you've been working hard all morning. No one's going to think you're rude because you want to improve." Hinata tried to draw encouragement from Naruto's words, but she could still feel scourged by her father's contempt for crude behavior. Her face was downcast as she tried to banish his hateful words. "Ano," she asked after a moment, "where are we going?" "This is the other half of my morning routine," he explained. "Guy and Lee train too early for me to eat breakfast first, and they work me hard, so I always have a healthy appetite, and here we are." He gestured grandly and Hinata realized that they were standing in front of Ichiraku's. "I have something to eat before I meet with Team 8. Go to make sure I don't pass out when we're looking for that damn cat again," Naruto said enthusiastically. He quickly looked left and right, and then leaned forward. "It's not quite as good as yours, of course," he whispered confidentially, "but nice and quick." Hinata found herself blushing again. It was nice how Naruto, and even Shino, always complimented her on cooking, especially when she wasn't that good. She prepared a few meals for her family on special occasions, and none of them had remarked on their quality. Still, it was nice that her teammates tried so hard to make her feel better, so she obliged him by smiling a little. A couple of villagers got up from the counter at that moment, and Naruto grabbed her hand and hauled her forward before someone else claimed the vacated stools. Hinata thought her knees were going to collapse when his fingers closed around hers, but she managed not to squeak. She knew her teammate was just concerned about filling his stomach, not that she wasn't hungry as well, but it was pleasant, for a moment, to pretend that he was holding her hand for other reasons. Futile, but pleasant. "Old man! You have no idea how much I miss this place," Naruto called out as he plopped down on one of the stools. Hinata was a bit quieter as she sat down as well, a little disappointed when Naruto let go of her hand. "Hello, Naruto," the old man called out happily. "It's been far too quiet these last few weeks." "Hey, I am. Look who's back." The cook's daughter looked up from the vegetables she was chopping. She smiled and waved at Naruto, and to Hinata's surprise the young woman winked at her when Naruto had turned back to her father. "So what's special today?" Naruto asked eagerly. "Himono with rice, miso soup, and pickled daikon," the old man replied with a smile. "That sounds perfect," Naruto said as he pulled out his bulging Gamachan wallet. Before they went to Moritake, Sensei had stopped at the bank and cashed in all 3 bingo book vouchers, splitting the money between the 4 of them. Hinata wanted to refuse at first, but after distracting Naruto for a moment, Kurenai-sensei had whispered to her that sharing the reward was one way for Naruto to lessen his anguish at being forced to take 2 lives. She didn't think he'd be able to enjoy any of the reward unless it was shared with his friends. That had effectively stifled any of Hinata's objections. She'd do anything to make him feel better. That said, she still didn't want him spending his money on her now. "Ah no, Naruto," she said quickly, "I can pay for my own," she objected. "That's okay," he said with a grin. "You can pay for tomorrow." Hinata opened her mouth and then closed it again. The strange and his student had invited her to train with them any time she wanted, but she was sure he was just being polite. Or perhaps he was just being courteous to Naruto, who they both seemed to respect. She was happy to see others who appreciated her friend's positive qualities, but she didn't want to presume upon that either. On the other hand, they did seem interested in studying her Juken techniques. Lee's commitment to defeating her cousin was laudable, and reminded her of Naruto's unflagging determination. While she was nowhere near Niji's level, perhaps she could help in some small way. But did that make her disloyal to her family? Guy said it would be good for Niji to be surprised occasionally, as it would make him less likely to underestimate a real opponent. At first she'd been a little dismayed to see how easily Naruto revealed his secret to Lee, in comparison to the difficulties he had telling her. In truth, he hadn't told her so much as give a few hints, and then confirm her guesses. It hurt to think that he could be so much more open with Lee. But then she noticed how he was smiling at her when he paused for breath in the middle, like they were sharing some secret joke. It made her very warm inside, this inclusive feeling. It was then that she realized that it was her and Shino's acceptance of him that made it easier for him to tell Lee. That alone had made the whole morning worthwhile. Lost in thought, Hinata was slow to notice as Naruto's face fell, but his words captured her attention. "Don't worry about it, Hinata," he said in a falsely cheery voice that she was only lately able to detect. "I know I keep some ridiculously long hours with all this training, so." Hinata shook her head. "I would be honored to train with the 3 of you, but will I not be more of a bother?" Whether she attended or not, she wasn't about to let Naruto think it had anything to do with him. She almost cringed when she realized he was hiding his true feelings again. That would not do at all. Naruto shook his head firmly. "Did you see all those notes Lee took? When they were assigned to Guy, he and Niji were put on the same team because Niji had the highest scores in the academy, while Lee barely passed. He doesn't talk about it, but I think your cousin said some things that first day that really ticked Lee off. He's been dying to find some way of defeating his eternal rival, and Guy wants all his hard work to pay off in the end." Hinata's eyes went wide at that explanation. Naruto didn't show it often, but she was occasionally surprised by how much he picked up on. Of course, training with someone 3 or 4 hours every day would doubtlessly give you a lot of insight into their character, but still I see, was all she could say to that. "I don't think it would be disloyal to my family to assist in training my cousin's teammate." The grin that split Naruto's face was genuine this time, much to Hinata's relief. The fake one made her feel slightly ill, wondering how long he had worn it to make the disguise so seamless. "You're the greatest, Hinata-chan." He beamed. Hinata ducked her head down instinctively, even as her cheeks reddened again. Fortunately, her embarrassing moment was cut short as the kindly older man set a pair of plates down before them. "Itadakimasu," they both said, Naruto in a far louder voice, and then they fell on their food like a pair of starving wolves. Hinata, as a Hyuga, of course maintained perfect table manners at all times, but her chopsticks moved rather quickly nonetheless. Aburaim Shino awoke and performed his morning ablutions with the same precision he always followed when at home. He moved through the house like a soundless wraith, and was soon tending a rather promising-looking colony of winged kikai bugs. Their ability to fly at an extremely high rate of speed gave them exceptional maneuverability, but they performed somewhat erratically under stress. It was thought that the enhanced speed with which they moved made that inevitable, but he and his father were testing that hypothesis by crossing them with more phlegmatic ground-born strains. Only 3 of the resulting substrains retained their wings, and only this one showed any signs of improved responsiveness or obedience. Despite his concentration, Shino was fully aware of the opening and closing of the door behind him. "Is there something you'd like to discuss?" his father asked in a low voice as he looked over his shoulder at the armature-mounted magnifying glass Shino was using to observe the queen's egg production. Perhaps, Shino allowed? He'd said barely 3 words since arriving home late the previous night. He was highly annoyed regarding some issues, but that was not sufficient reason for him to behave in an overly emotional manner. Shouting at his parents and the clan elders would be highly counterproductive, even if it would entail a certain, visceral, satisfaction. I know the secret behind the Hokage's lore regarding Uzumaki Naruto, he finally said. I see, his father said with a quiet sigh. I suppose I should see the Hokage about getting you assigned to another team? Shino turned toward his father. Why would I desire such an irrational action to be taken on my behalf? He asked in a clipped monotone. Aburaim Shibi opened his mouth, but then closed it without speaking. After a moment he began again. I assumed that your anger was related to the secret being revealed. As this is apparently not the case, I will await your interpretation of the situation. Shino adjusted his sunglasses. My dissatisfaction with the situation stems from the attitude of the elders toward my teammate, a shinobi who had borne a large burden, practically since birth, with a dignity and aplomb that leaves me embarrassingly humbled, he said in a tight voice. Despite this, the elders of our clan openly disparaged him throughout his childhood. This attitude, promulgated through the elder generation, infected the thinking of myself and others of our cohort, to the extent that their distaste for Uzumaki Naruto was communicated, in full, to practically everyone he came into contact with. I now find myself questioning the judgment, rationality, and fitness to lead the elders, as well as the rest of their generation. I find myself questioning the Aburaim clan's commitment to logic, and whether I still have a place within it. Shibi's eyebrows were completely visible above his sunglasses. Shino's statement was the equivalent, in Aburaim terms, of shouting himself hoarse and setting all their houses on fire. I see, he said slowly. I admit I have had little to no contact with the boy. Most of my opinions were likewise formed listening to reports from our representative to the village council. I believe he is known as a chronic prankster, and many have petitioned the Hokage to have him removed from the academy or censured in other ways. Naruto's eccentricities, Shino said, choosing his words with care, are somewhat understandable when viewed in light of his almost total social isolation. It is also a matter of public record that since he began working with Kurenai-sensei and teammate, Naruto has yet to pull a prank on any of the villagers. Aburaim Shibi stared at his son for a long moment. What do you intend to do at this point? He finally asked. I would speak with the Aburaim elders regarding Naruto, Shino answered. Loyalty to my teammate and a fellow shinobi of the Leaf demands no less. And if they refuse to ameliorate their attitudes? Shibi asked. I believe one of Uzumaki's sayings comes to mind, Shino replied. We'll burn that bridge when we get to it. Thanks for watching. I hope you had as much fun as I did putting this epic what if together. Make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a single twist in the story. Drop your thoughts, theories, or even wild ideas in the comments. I read every single one. And hey, if you're craving more awesome Naruto content, go check out the other videos on the channel. I've got plenty of heat waiting for you. Until next time, stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember, even a shadow clone needs love. Peace out.